Thank you for joining us today, both in person and online, for this important stakeholder meeting, plastic particles and allergies, a stakeholder dialogue on emerging risks. I'm Tanja Cirković-Veličković. I'm Imptox project coordinator, and I'm also professor at the Faculty of Chemistry, University of Belgrade. It is indeed a pleasure to open today's discussion on a topic of a growing concern, micro and nanoplastics and their potential impacts on human health, particularly for our project, very relevant, their links to hypersensitivity disorders, especially allergic diseases and asthma. Our project is funded by the European Union's Horizon 2020 program, and it brought together leading experts from different fields 4 years ago to study the impacts of micro nanoplastics exposure through inhalation and ingestion, and how these particles interact with environmental pollutants, particularly those relevant for allergies. So I'm truly pleased to see so many of you. I know there are strikes of trains in Belgium. So I hope the ones who could not get here because of the strikes, that they could follow this discussion online. I'm also pleased to see so many colleagues from Belgrade University here. They managed to come despite the students protesting in our country for already 3 months. So the challenge, however, we are discussing today affects all of us, scientists, policymakers, physicians, industry representatives, also members of the public. And today we are not here only as researchers, we are also here as citizens, as patients, potential patients, of course. Science is not an isolated endeavor, it is deeply embedded in our society, and with it comes a profound ethical responsibility, a responsibility to share our findings, a responsibility to be transparent about the research. Micro and nanoplastics are a pressing issue, and while we continue to investigate the potential health effects, we cannot wait for absolute certainty before we act. Awareness and precaution are the key, so this is also very important stakeholder dialogue to raise the awareness of this potentially harmful issue. And the more we understand, the better we can mitigate risks and push the solutions that will safeguard both current and future generations. So I'm truly honored to open today's discussion on this crucial topic, particularly in the context of allergic diseases, which already affect millions worldwide. While scientific insight is the basis of our progress, its true impact emerges only when we partner with society to turn knowledge into action. And for this, we need dialogue. And that is why today's event is so important. Our goal is not just to present findings, but to create a space where ideas can be exchanged, concerns can be voiced, and solutions can emerge. The presence of stakeholders from different sectors today is encouraging because it shows that this is not just a scientific discussion, it's a societal one. Together, we can move towards preventive initiatives and policies that will minimize exposure and improve public health. So this morning, we will hear from experts who will share their latest research on micro and nanoplastics and their health effects. There will be opportunities for discussion, and I encourage you to participate, to ask questions, and engage. This is a shared responsibility, and every perspective matters. So once again, thank you for being here. I look forward to an insightful and inspiring dialogue. Today's agenda includes I should move the slides. So the first lecture will be an overview on plastic particles and allergies by Ian Madway, a scientific advisor of our project. And then I will have the pleasure to shortly present our project objectives and progress regarding the micro nanoplastics health risk assessments in Imptox. Then we will proceed with a series of presentations from our researchers who will talk about the key elements of our micro and nanoplastics health risk assessment framework and present their findings. Then we will have 2 rounds on presentations Thank you so much. Yeah. Then we will have 2 rounds of presentations with a coffee break in between. And before lunch, we will hold a stakeholder discussion, and we invite you to participate actively, ask questions, and engage in the dialogue. Then we will also collect questions through Slido. So join us at slido.com. Here is the code. So you can scan the QR code or insert the code on your application now and access it during the question and answer sessions later. So once again, thank you for being here. Now let's start with our first speaker for today, Madhway, our scientific advisor coming from Imperial College London. Dr. Madhway is senior lecturer at Imperial College London School of Public Health and a member of multiple research centres, including the MRC Centre for Environment and Health. With over 25 years of experience, he specializes in studying air pollution's effect on human health and developing assays to measure pollutant toxicity. His current research focuses on the impact of air pollution on early life, lung, and cognitive development in newborn children and investigates the biological mechanisms driving these adverse effects and individual susceptibility to pollutants. Ian will give us an initial general overview on plastic particles and allergies. The floor is yours.
Good morning, everyone. I'm going to try to give you an overview without being too opinionated, but it's never happened in the past, and so it's probably going to happen again. And I've got 15 minutes, far too many slides, and I have to talk about allergies, asthma, and plastics, and that's a huge topic, and so let's fire at it. What I'm really going to do to set the scene is to outline the challenge, talk about what is and isn't known, because this is a field where more is not known than is known. Great opportunities for new learning, and to give a few of my sort of like general observations on the field and the things we can learn from the knowledge which already exists. Number one, these are not inconsiderable problems. They matter. These are the latest figures I can get for Europe on the number of European citizens with asthma, with the number with food allergies, the overall costs to the EU. Well, I've listed some things here, and this comes from the EAACA report, but we're talking about 100 million lost working days, school days per year because of asthma and allergies. In terms of costs to the EU, we're looking in a range, and economists never agree, so there's always a very broad range, but somewhere between 55 billion to 150 billion euros per annum in avoidable costs because of the exacerbations and the work-related sort of loss of productivity associated with allergies per se. This whole project is about how much of that burden can be attributed to something which is effectively the new kid on the block. How much of this can be attributed to micro and nanoplastics? And we don't start from square one. We know the risk factors. We know the genetic risk factors, and asthma has a large proportion of genetic risk. A lot of family risks being handed down. We know that smoking matters. We know that poor birth outcomes matter. We know that viral infections in early life are important in setting asthma. And so we already know a lot. And we mustn't forget what we know as we move into a new field to progress. But here's the thing. I'm going to drop allergies now, partially, because it's too much to deal with and just talk about asthma. But what's asthma? As though asthma is some simple, simplistic entity. You know, when I was young, and that was a long time ago, it was simple, wasn't it? There was early onset, there was late onset, or there was some occupational, there was some exercise-induced asthma, there was atopic and non-atopic asthma, and there's much more now, because you can pull it apart. You can look at all of the different presentations. And so asthma isn't asthma. Asthma is an umbrella term for a range of very common symptoms beneath which there is a whole host of different disease mechanisms driving different presentations of the disease. So the question isn't really, how does microplastic affect allergies or asthma? It's how do microplastics and nanoplastics affect specific phenotypes, specific endotypes of asthma? Who is it within the community who are the really vulnerable people? Because they're the individuals we have to identify, and those are the individuals we have to study. We also know what the triggers are for exacerbations. And when you find a new thing and you're interested in the new thing, you can't lose sight of what we already know. We know about the infections, the dust mites, we know about the cigarette smoking, the mold, the cockroaches. We know about the air pollution, and there are so many lessons to learn from air pollution that we can bring to this field in terms of how this field matures and uses the evidence that it is generating in its very, very early days. Now, fortunately, in this project, it's not just, I think, micro and nanoparticles. It's micro nanoparticles and allergens and toxins. There's already the understanding that you have to look at the mixture and the combination if you want to get an understanding of the holistic impact of these new materials on health. So lessons from air pollution. Consider this if we are going to try to move towards a position where we want to have a statement for Europe, a health impact assessment for microplastics. This is 15 years ago. This is the US Health Effects Institute's report on traffic-related air pollution and health in a field which was already massively mature at this time, with in vivo studies, experimental studies, in vitro studies, short-term and long-term epidemiological studies. And if you go back to this report, back in 2010, it goes through all of the evidence. And you don't have to go through this in great detail, but it kind of takes all of the evidence and it says, how robust is it? Are we certain? How certain can we be? Are we partially certain? Where are we on this kind of causal understanding pipeline? Is it just suggestive, or is it really, really robust? And if I take something which is probably one of the most sensitive, I think, indicators of an inhaled toxin's effect on health, childhood asthma and exacerbation. Back in 2010, I don't have a pointer here, I don't think. It was sufficient to suggestive, only sufficient to suggestive in a field which had already matured for over 30 to 40 years. This field is brand new. Yeah? Always bear that in mind. Here are some other things, because the air pollution thing is fascinating, because somewhere buried within this air pollution data are all your microplastics that we breathe. I could quite easily say all of the time series long-term studies we have ever done probably have microplastic hazard in them. We just don't know how much of it is. And it's still contemporary. This is data from my own city. Let me go to the big version here. This is asthma in London. These are all GP consultants, GP appointments for respiratory disease, stratified by age, all the way from all ages, 0 to 17, 18 to 16, looking at the day of an air pollution episode, and then the day before, the day after, the week before. And you can see significant increases in consultations across the board, irregardless of whether it's juvenile asthma or aged asthma. They're all vulnerable. At the levels, and what's this? London's, this is NO2. So NO2 is a good proxy for diesel exhaust, but also traffic generally. What are we looking at here? We're looking at levels of maybe in London at this point around 35 to 45 micrograms per meter cubed of NO2, probably around 15 micrograms per meter cubed of PM2.5. And we still have this effect. And it's not just association. Some interesting experiments have been done. I'm highlighting this because I want to pull your attention to two numbers. This is an experimental study where asthmatic individuals were walked up and down Oxford Street, which is a very high traffic, very high diesel environment, or they walked around the round pond in Hyde Park. It was kind of like two controls. And if you look here, you can see the pollution levels. Well, let's just think of particles, because people talk about microplastic particles. This is the low particle concentration, that's 18,000-ish particles per cubic centimetre. This is Oxford Street, that's about 64,000 particles per cubic centimetre, all nanoparticles, all nanoscale. And when the asthmatics walked through that location, what they saw was lung function dropped very, very rapidly. And also, if you look over here in this bar, the blue bar showing an increase in activated degranulating neutrophils in the airway. So the traffic in that city was aggravating the airways. It was inducing central airway inflammation and neutrophilic inflammation, which is never good in an asthmatic, in the airways. So all of that statistics. And here's my next core message. Statistics and data is fantastic. Stories win. This is Ella Adu Kissi Deborah. She died of a severe asthma attack in 2013 on the 15th of February, 3 weeks after her 9th birthday. She had a history of difficult and complicated asthma, and nobody knew why she died. And after her death, her mother began to wonder whether it was air pollution, and so reopened the inquest. 4 years ago, this young lady was the first person in the United Kingdom, in my country, to have air pollution as a contributing factor added to their death certificate. This one story changed more in the United Kingdom about air quality than all of that statistics beforehand, because it put a face on those numbers. Those consultations, those deaths are now a person people can relate to. But what is this stuff? This dust in the air? Look, I've talked about NO2, I could have talked about fine particles, PM2.5, and it's a bit of a mixture, and it comes from all different places. And somewhere again, in here, in this mixture, there are micro and nanoparticles. We're just not very good at knowing how much, because the methods for measuring them are only really in their infancy. They're getting there, but they're certainly struggling at this very, very low end. And then we kind of know that it's not just what they're made of, it's how big they are. And then we have to know how they interact with the lung, or if you eat them with the gut. And then there's the question of dosyometry, which is always forgotten. Yes, everywhere everybody forgets about dosyometry, and it's so vital. And then at the top, all of those things have to be applied to micro and nanoparticles. And the public think, I would guarantee that they already have been, because it's all in the press and all of the questions have already been answered, and they haven't, because it is so brand new. But it's a big problem. I'm going to flick now to plastics. We know we have a plastic problem. Go figure. We know the environment has a huge amount. Certainly in the United Kingdom, everybody's obsessed with plastic in the oceans, and they forget that most of the plastic is actually locked into landfill sites in the United Kingdom, about the world. But it is a massive problem. And it's a massive problem in terms of health because of the way we talk about it as well. A micro nanoplastic less than 5 millimeters in length is not helpful. Yeah? If you're going to use it for inhalation toxicology, you're going to have to shift that definition, or nobody's going to understand what you're talking about. Yes? It's going to have to be PM10, it's going to have to be PM2.5, it's going to have to be nanoparticles. We know it's in the air. These are the concentrations which have been measured falling out of the air. These aren't PM2.5. Generally speaking, they're usually TSP, total suspended particles. So you can imagine smaller ones, they still have to be quantified. But look, these are 100 to maybe 1,000 particles per cubic meter per day, as opposed to 70,000 at a roadside per cubic centimeter. So even if they're there, they are there as a minority of the content of the particles in air. Doesn't mean they're not important, but it means that when you think about them, you've got to think about them in the context of the cloud of all the other stuff that we're breathing in the air. Now, if I was to put my money on one thing, which I would be concerned about, which the public could be exposed to, and there could be a big source of micro and nanoparticles, it would be this: tire wear. Now, there's a huge debate. People who work in tire wear and have for 20 years really don't like you calling it micro and nanoplastics. They get furious because tire wear isn't just synthetic and natural rubber. It's a lot of other things. But here we have a real exposure, because at the roadside, about 7 to 8% of PM 2.5 and 10 is from tire wear. And that's probably your biggest slug, exposure of micro and nanoplastics, when people get around to accurately quantifying it. And they're pretty close, I think. So that's where I think some of our attention should be going as we move forward. And here's the risk. So at the moment, this field is dominated by experimental medicine. Epidemiologists haven't really had an opportunity to play because we don't have the measurements to give them for them to estimate their exposures. But you can, because we have global models. We can estimate what the global concentration of PM 2.5 is, and we know that equates to what? 8 million excess deaths per year, indoors and outdoors combined. And we can work out, we can do a bit of maths and say, this is the tire wear component of that. And very soon somebody will, if they haven't already, simply go, if tire wear is 6 to 7% of PM 2.5 and PM 2.5 is killing 8 million people, that percentage of 8 million is the number of deaths caused by microplastics. And it is not. It is a piece of maths on the back of an envelope. We need to get the experimental data stronger to support that sort of approach. That's my rant. This is just to tell you that tires are very complicated. I know I'm going to run out of time. And I also have to say this because it annoys me. Plastics themselves are very complicated. If you're studying microplastics, particles and fibers, please don't forget about the additives which are added to it. Very often we sit there and we go, plastics and fibers, there isn't a big toxicological evidence base. When you go to the additives, there is. Some of these additives have their toxicity profiles worked out. But what's the dose? Always the question, what is the dose? And then, of course, in addition to the fact that you've got all these particles and they're a heterogeneous fog of stuff, they don't stand still. They get released into the environment. Things stick to them, biological material, toxins, fragments of allergens, and then they get into the body and they get coated with our biological material. So a nanoparticle in the fiber entering the body isn't simply a nanoparticle anymore. It's actually an assemblage of the exogenous and the endogenous and the ecological all together. Think of the dimensions of this problem. You could study this for 1,000 years and still only do a small part of that matrix. But we do have to understand the problem. But please never forget this. The dose makes the poison. The dosiometry matters. When we do our experiments, it's not informative to use unrepresentative doses of particles and to simply assume that that can be related back to the environment. We need, even if we start with higher doses to demonstrate models work, we have to rapidly titrate them down to something which is plausible for real-world environmental exposure. And I would argue probably we need to look at those effects in the context of the entire mixture. And I do not say that trivially because many ships have sunk on the sort of like seething ocean of mixture toxicology. We all know this, but the reality is that's kind of what we have to do. And then I'm just going to say two things, because sometimes in Europe and in the industrial nations, we can be a bit nasal gazy. And sometimes we can pretend to be very virtuous when actually some of our recycling is really just getting rid of our plastic and sending it to the developing world for them to hide it from us. And in the developing world, they have a much bigger problem than we have. So let's not forget about them. In fact, there are actual industries where they take the plastics, melt it, put it into bricks, and then burn it for energy and heating. Those individuals are the individuals who probably have the highest exposures, and they must not be forgotten in all of this. And I just illustrate, this is in Bangladesh, this is one of the compounds released from burning of plastic, and the concentrations are off the scale. Most plastics has not been recycled. I threw this in. This is how much of European plastics has been recycled. The take-home message is most of it isn't. Despite all our virtuous words, most of it is not recycled. Most of it is just making a problem bigger. I'm going to leave you with this. And I did do 20 minutes and you can shoot me for it, but I'm going to leave you with this. This is a hero of mine. This is Bradford Hill. Bradford Hill did some of the seminal work which demonstrated that cigarette smoking was related to lung cancer. And in his work, he came up with 8 criteria that had to be satisfied for you to demonstrate that something, an exogenous agent, a chemical agent, was actually causally related to a health effect. And they stand true today as a sort of yardstick for measuring progress on anything we do. There has to be strength of association. There has to be consistency of association between the exposure and an adverse effect. We're nowhere near that in this field. There has to be temporality. You can't have the exposure after the disease. The exposure has to come before the disease, yes? That's straightforward. There has to be biological plausibility. I think we've got some. It's getting that biological plausibility within a realistic frame. We need a dose-response relationship, fundamental, often forgotten. We need coherence. We should not expect micro and nanoplastics to behave completely different from every other particle and fiber that we've ever seen. Let's not throw away. I always think the first toxicologist who did his toxicology on particles and fibers would be throwing away about 350 years of prior knowledge if we started from ground zero again. And specificity. Is the effect you see caused by micro and nanoplastic, or is it caused by something else in the mixture? How do you work that out? How do you design those experiments? This is early days. This program of work addresses some of these points, but it is early days, and this is an area which needs very sharp minds and very critical thought to take itself forward in order to make sure the best science drives our understanding in this field. Thank you.
So my name is Leanne Daly, and I'm going to be your moderator for the next part of the session. And I'd like to thank Ian once more for those wonderful words. If you have questions specifically for Ian, I'd like to encourage you to use the Slido function or save them to the very end when we have a group discussion. And so now I am going to switch topics and start. Can I grab some help for, I don't know if the next slides are on this presentation. Excuse me for just a moment while I. Yeah. I
think this is my overview presentation.
Okay, yes.
And
thank you.
Introduce you.
Sorry, I had been gathering. Yeah. Okay. So I'd like to introduce Tanya to give her presentation on the risk framework assessment for allergy and asthma. And after that, we will move on to our panel of speakers. Tanya, thank you very much.
Thank you, Leanne. It's obvious you did not practice this program. So thank you, Ian, for giving a very nice overview of the problem. Actually, we are dealing with the plastics and a very complex disease, such as allergies and asthma, which is not only one disease. And also, it's quite complex because it has 2 stages, the initiation phase, the sensitization phase, and then the effector phase. And a compound or material we are studying could, in fact, influence both stages of the disease. So it's quite complex to actually study the impacts of these new particles on the immune system. Also, what I have to say in our project, which of course focuses on the improving the understanding of the health effects of micro and nanoplastics, also improving some exposure assessment, trying to see if there is a relationship with allergic diseases and to evaluate the role as vectors for contaminants. We focused only on the 2 exposure routes, so the inhalation and ingestion. We had to focus when we put the concept of this project 5 years ago. We kind of overlooked this dermal exposure to allergens, co-exposure to allergens and plastics, and we focus on inhalation and ingestion. Maybe it is something we can focus on for future research. At the moment in our project, that in fact had to deal with a lot of different materials, different additives, quite a heterogeneous mixture of micro nanoplastics we can find in the environment without the impact of the environment, both external and internal, on the aging process of micro nanoplastics and different plastic chemicals, which brings new layers of complexity. On top of this, we also had to focus our research on the materials we could in fact produce in-house in sufficient amounts to provide material for the in vitro and in vivo testing in the project. So Leanne will talk about our achievements when it comes to the micro nanoplastics, how we produce, particularly the nano size was challenging. And we focus on two materials, PT and PP, because they come from food packaging and butcher battles. So we assume that it would be something we find as relevant for studying the co-exposure to these materials with allergens we find in the environment, in food, and also in the air. We're talking about the respiratory allergies. We also wanted to shed light on the contaminants effect, how they interact with the plastics, not only the allergens, also different microorganisms, metals not as allergens, even they can be allergens, but simply as maybe co-founding factors in the immune system responses, and different toxins. So our health outcome assessment framework has several key features that we wanted to actually stress and to work at. We wanted to identify, analyze, and prioritize the results, to integrate this and establish the kind of a cross-harmonized matrices, and to focus on hazards relevant to allergy outcomes. We also wanted a targeted assessment. The idea of creating this framework was to provide actionable insight. Our findings will be of use and guide public health and regulatory adjustments, and also preventive strategies. And also we may establish this association, if it exists, in one population, and then we may model in others. So our framework integrates risk assessment data like in all similar frameworks. We look into the hazard, into the dose response, into the exposure assessment, and finally, we want to establish the health effect assessment. Actually, we aimed to. The key components of the framework are, of course, the characterization of the particles and their characteristics that could be relevant for this association with the disease, then the effects of contaminants, the exposure assessment, and the health effects assessment. So today, throughout the day, you will hear from different researchers and research groups their contribution to the key factors or the key components of this framework assessment in Imptox, starting from particles, going into in vitro, in vivo models, and our clinical study. So when it comes to the micro nanoplastic characterization, as I said, we focus on tool materials and with the idea to produce sufficient amounts of well-characterized particles for the in vivo and in vitro testing. Also, when it comes to the plastic exposure, we wanted to gain a comprehensive understanding of exposure to micro nanoplastics and indirectly to allergy risk, and also in relation to the model allergies that we have selected, such as respiratory allergies to birch pollen and ragweed pollen, and also food allergies coming from shellfish. And we have estimated that the exposure in air, at least in the locations we have studied, was quite low in rural air samples, and also in seafood samples that came from the markets. The number of microparticles per kilogram is quite low. So we can say that the exposure to the micro nanoplastics is relatively low. Of course, we cannot say anything about we don't have a definitive conclusion because the exposure estimation is still limited. And also we do not have any health-based guidance level to say this is good or it's bad. As I said, the effects of contaminants and the effects of the co-exposure of micro-nanoplastics and allergens, the microorganisms, toxins, and metals was studied in different in vivo and in vivo settings. And of course, now finally, the health effect assessment or the any association between the different allergic diseases and exposure to plastic was studied in a population of Croatian children. We recruited nearly 1,000 children. Of course, we could not evaluate for the micro-nanoplastic exposure, all of them, just a very small part, but at least the exposure to plastics was investigated through the use of a questionnaire and also the certain biomonitoring in micro-nanoplastic, as I said, in a limited, randomly selected patients was studied in stool and also in exhaled breath condensate. So these are just like the final figures that we just got from the stool exposure, micro-nanoplastics in stool samples and the correlation to allergy in this population. First of all, because the Croatian population was quite, heterogeneous. Patients were recruited from 3 different regions, from the capital, which is a urban area, also from the rural area of Slavonia and the seaside. Statistically, there are significant differences regarding the sensitization, and we will hear more in more details later from our clinical partners. We have a region of the seaside, Dalmatia region, where there is a very high sensitization rate to and polysensitization rate to respiratory allergens, but then we have the highest food allergy rate in Zagreb. The micro-nanoplastics in stool samples, as investigated, is in a group of 56 children, show that the urban Zagreb is, can say, mostly contaminated. From ingestion, that the types of the polymers we found in children mostly originate from food packaging. So this is a very important information. So at least if we want to prevent this exposure of children, we should reduce the use of polypropylene and the polyethylene, which was found at the highest frequency in the stool. The association with allergies were relatively low, except in the Zagreb, urban Zagreb area. But as I said, this is relatively small number for statistics. So finally, there is a lot of missing and bottlenecks to evaluate and to say with certainty there is a risk or there is no risk. Anyhow, we have contributed with some of the key components regarding the particles characterization, the micro-nanoplastics as vectors, the different in vitro and in vivo hazard assessment experiments demonstrated the correlations, and of course to be able to improve the risk and finally to evaluate the health effects, we definitely need more data. For now, what we can say that at least in the acute exposure and high doses of micro-nanoplastics in different in vitro and in vivo assays, we observe a positive correlation between the co-exposure of micro-nanoplastics and allergies. However, we do not have all the information needed to complete a risk assessment, let alone environmentally relevant complex mixtures. We need to move from the acute exposure and relatively high doses of micro to more environmentally relevant. We also need to include an exposure data from the nanoplastics, which are still missing. And of course, we need to improve our models. We have already improved in vitro and in vivo models to evaluate hazard, but we need to improve them more. So I finally, for this framework assessment, want to thank all the partners who contributed with their data. Also Mirjana for conceptualization of the framework, risk framework, and Maxime from Science Ano for visual presentation. And of course, the CASP cluster for collaboration, for know-how exchange and material exchange, and also harmonization and standardization of methods. So during the day, you will hear in more details about the key results and the key components. And now I will pass the word to Leanne, who will present a quality by design, inspired approach to develop PET and PP nanoplastics. Thanks. I will just say a few words about you, if okay. So Leanne Daly is a professor of pharmaceutical technology and biopharmacy at the University of Vienna. Her research integrates pharmaceutical materials and environmental sciences to study how polymeric nanomaterials interact with the respiratory system. For years, she has examined the effects of these tailored materials on lung health within the Horizon 2020 Imptox project. Her team designs specialized test materials and conducts inhalation exposure studies to evaluate the impact of micro and nanoplastics on lung health. Leanne, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Okay, so we're a bit behind time, so I'm going to try to move this forward quite quickly. I wanted to start, though, by introducing a few key terms because I've got a very wordy title. Basically, what our aim was to do in this project was make materials in high enough quantities that our partners could use. But as Ian said, there's complexity in these types of materials, and to be able to identify specificity of a reaction to the materials, you actually need a series of materials. And the materials I'm going to speak about today are very pristine materials with not many additives, with a very well-defined surface. And we're going to try to use those as a benchmark to a second set of materials that we would produce then in the future, which contain the additives and a slightly higher level of complexity. Now, to do this, we need to plan these materials very carefully. And that's what the quality by design concept does. Quality by design basically is, is a framework that is used by a number of different industries. It was developed in the automobile industry many decades ago, used very heavily in the pharmaceutical industry. And what it does is it guides a product development process. And it starts out with predefined objectives, where you actually, before you even go to the lab, you list the number of qualities that your desired product will have. Then you go into the lab and you start understanding how the process of making these products impacts their properties. And then you find out which processes are key and you control those processes so that you always get the same product each time you produce a batch. And at the moment, we're working in small batch sizes, which means that to feed the needs of our project partners, we actually do have to make a number of batches. And so we use quality by design to make sure that every batch comes with a certification that the key properties are always the same. Our two materials, as Tanya said, are polypropylene and polyethylene terephthalate. One is a high-density material and one is a low-density material. And they have very different chemical structures, which means they will have different properties. And the project that I'm going to talk about today is specifically designing nanoplastics from these materials, and we're going to define these as submicron size nanoplastics. Now, the nanoplastics materials that we wanted to produce needed to have certain key characteristics to be useful for our partners. So we wanted to make sure that every time our partners use these materials, they produce the same size distribution in a number of different media. We didn't want to have any additives because we want to use these as benchmarking materials for when we do have environmentally relevant particles. We don't want any exogenous surfactants, so we don't want to have additives that help disperse the particles because our partners may not want that in their assays. We want to have contaminant-free particles so that there aren't any microorganisms or other things, residual solvents that could falsify the results. They needed to be stable for a long time and come in a packaging that allows our partners to dose at whatever concentration they want. So there's flexibility in their experimental design. And then, of course, we wanted to make sure that it's reproducible so that all of the labs using the materials have the same product. We found that a number of the published methods used to prepare such particles could fulfill some of these criteria, but not all of them. And so a partner actually came up with the idea that you could perhaps make these particles and then store them in a liquid medium as using the storage medium glycerol as kind of a way to keep them contamination free and also to help disperse them into other media. So we decided to try to produce a product where we had our plastics that are stored in glycerol at a really high concentration. And then our project partners are given an SOP, a standard operating procedure, to be able to dilute our material from this glycerol storage medium. And glycerol was adopted because it is relatively well tolerated in both cell culture experiments up to a certain concentration, as well as in vivo. I'm not going to go through the entire production process, but we actually have just recently published all of our production methods on Zenodo, and so therefore you can go and look at these production methods in great detail. But we use a precipitation procedure, which allows us to produce materials at very high concentrations with an exceptional yield, usually above 80%. That just means that we can make a lot of material for our partners. And once we precipitate these materials into an anti-solvent, which is ethanol, we don't keep them in ethanol because ethanol is not as well tolerated for cells. So we transfer the particles from ethanol to glycerol. And as you can see in the pictures, this production process generates slightly spherical, somewhat irregular particles. They're small in the about 100 nanometer size range. You can see that sometimes they tend to aggregate a little bit, but they are dispersible in other media. And the dispersion of these materials caused us a lot of headaches, actually. They are very, very hydrophobic on their surface, so they love to stick together. But we did develop over many, many iterations, some really good dispersion protocols. And as you can see by the curves that overlap each other, over many, many batches, we get the same particle size, which was one of our key specifications. And we defined a successful batch as being a batch where over 85% of all the materials is less than 1 micron in size or diameter, so they're in the submicron range. In these pictures here, you see that we've used a very aggressive dispersion process, which uses a synthetic surfactant known as tween. And we use these aggressive dispersion methods just to see what the true particle size of our product is, the particles. Now, this is not always the type of dispersion that our project partners want. They want to be able to take the material and disperse it into, let's say, a protein-based medium to look at the corona formation, or they want to use it in cell culture medium to look at toxicity. So we also developed a number of different dispersion protocols using what we call biorelevant media. And this means that we take different proteins and we do a two-step dilution process to see whether we can get the same particle size with a biorelevant dispersing agent. Now, here we've got some disappointing news. With certain particles it works and certain other particles it doesn't. So PET is a relatively hydrophilic polymer compared to some of the others. And you can see that with our optimized dispersion protocol, we can get exactly the same particle size distribution as the original particles. Now, polypropylene, on the other hand, is quite hydrophobic, and our production method means that we have very hydrophobic materials. And despite our best efforts to date, with this dispersion protocol, we see a shift to larger particle sizes, which just means that our polypropylene particles do sometimes aggregate. And this is information that we're trying to provide to our users to show how different materials handle differently. Now, the next big important specification for our materials was that they did not contain any microbial contamination or endotoxin contamination, because these could affect cell culture experiments and their results. So we did a sterility testing of 22 different batches of material to see if our production method leads to a contamination. And luckily for us, we saw that there were no contaminations in any of the batches tested. And even after a year with unopened containers, we still maintained sterility. We had positive controls in there just to make sure that we were doing it properly. And we also could not detect any endotoxin in the product above the limit of detection of the test. And so we're fairly sure that the production process, even though it's not under perfectly clean room conditions, does lead to materials that can be used in vitro and in vivo assays. Finally, we looked a little bit at the cytocompatibility of our glycerol vehicle, because the one problem with glycerol is that at high enough concentrations, it's going to contribute to the osmotic pressure in the system. And so what we did was we first did an entire cytocompatibility study with cells. So we basically incubated cells with glycerol at increasing concentrations up to about 4%. And on the table, you can see what the osmolarity is of these cell culture medium with glycerol. And as expected, once we get up to a hyperosmotic concentration of glycerol, that means above about 400 milliosmol per mole, then we see cytotoxicity. And we can deduce that that just means that the glycerol is stressing the cells out because it's in there in too high concentrations. So we have an upper limit of glycerol that can be tolerated in certain cells. This upper limit, though, is much higher than the relative range of concentrations that many people are using in their cytotoxicity experiments with plastics. So we did another study where we just diluted our plastic-containing materials with the glycerol, the plastics, and any residual materials from the production process. And we looked at the cytotoxicity in Calo3 cells over a number of batches. And over the concentration range of up to 150 micrograms of particles per milliliter, we did not see any cytotoxicity. Now, I'd like to explain something here really quickly. We didn't want to actually look at particle cytotoxicity in this particular example, so we weren't looking at dosimetry events here. What we were doing is trying to check to see if any of the residual production process materials had an impact on the cells. And so we didn't see anything in this particular experiment. So we were quite happy that the material, the product we were providing with the vehicle and any residual components did not cause artifacts in a cytotoxicity experiment. So at the very end, I'd just like to summarize the small experimental data set by saying that this quality by design process really helped us to organize our thoughts about what kinds of materials our users might need and how we can deliver that in a particular product. And what we still need to do is we need to look at this product and how it behaves in a much larger range of bioassays to see if the glycerol may perhaps have any effect on corona formation studies, or we have to look at other cell types. So the work is ongoing. The next thing that we need to do is also now start adding additives to our particles so that we can compare particles with and without additives. We'd like to age these particles to see if we can change the surface, and therefore start setting out a series of products with very defined characteristics that our users can use. We are hopefully going to be publishing in Environmental Sciences Nano very soon. We had very, very minor comments from the reviewers who were very positive about the paper, and we're hoping for an acceptance very soon. So if you're interested, keep your eye out for this paper and you can see a lot more detail and have access to many more of the protocols. And with that, I'd like to thank all of the people who contributed to this work. It was actually a work that covered different CUSP projects. And I'd especially like to thank my PhD students who did the most of the work. Thank you very much for your time. And we're going to now, in the interest of time, skip questions. Again, if you have any questions, please address them by Slido. And I'd like to then ask our next speaker to come up. That is Dr. Mariana Angelkovic. She's a senior research scientist at Sciensano. Sorry, I'm a bit slow. And her work focuses on estimating and understanding dietary exposure to contaminants and food additives to support Belgian policy and risk assessment. And with that, Mariana, please.
So I was actually wondering how I can take off this part, and can I click on the...
Is just hit this button.
Yeah, voilà, that's it.
No,
I hope.
it was. There we go.
So we will be able
That's
to...
it. So try
Yeah.
hitting this.
Okay, I see. Yeah, I was bothered by these small things here, so because they will bother also on the slide, but we will see on the way how it goes. So let's try like this. Okay, so thank you so much for patience. So we will see how it goes. But let's go for the exposure assessment to micro and nanoplastics. So which one was it? We go there. I have your in the...
Oh, sorry. I was in the...
Okay, and we go like this. Yeah, thank you so much. Well, apparently it's better like this. So I will try to assist as well with the slides. So what I wanted to say here, we heard already that micro and nanoplastics actually can be everywhere. So just to remind, the sources are really diversified and different. But what we have here also on the slide is that some of them that we are talking about are food and air pollution. But what is important as well for Imptox is that we have to specify which sources actually we took into account when we looked at the exposure. And we focused on food, on water, and air. But what we wanted to do here in Imptox, actually, when we talk about food, we focus on seafood. And also to be on the seafood, I'm struggling a bit with the slides, but it's okay. So to focus on the seafood and to perform the exposure assessment, actually, we had to have the food, we have to collect the seafood, and we have to have the population to measure their consumption. So this is also the part of this sampling. And then we had to have a target. So we had to measure something in food, and we have to know how much people consume that food in order to match them. So to integrate them and to perform the exposure assessment. The first one was very simple, but this one is more complex because it explains all the process and all the steps that we do in exposure assessment. So it starts with also measuring the micro and nanoparticles. Then we have to look, is it single or combined exposure? What is the route that we are evaluating? So we have to take all of this into account to calculate and define our exposure scenarios. The toxicological data, we are constantly following up what kind of toxicological data are appearing because we have to characterize afterwards the risk. But then we wait for the analysis from our colleagues and our partners on the microplastics. And once we have them, then we can perform the exposure assessment. So then we are estimating actually how much we are exposed to micro and nanoplastics. But before we did, because we had time while our colleagues were developing the reference materials, developing the methods, we said, okay, let's prepare us. And we prepared ourselves by reading the literature. That is very important. Everybody did that. But why we did it? We did it with some other objectives. For us, it was important to see what is there, how different the results are, and how people are reporting the results. So what we noticed first, so by the years, we started to follow the articles from 2014, 2023, we did this evaluation. And then 2016 was for us also important year because we know EFSA published a paper or an opinion on microplastics. So for us, when we are working on exposure and dietary exposure, this is the year that we have to take into account. They did a lot of work, so we start also from there. And also 2014, 2023 is just around 120 years since since plastic became actually and entered the world. So in 1907, there was the patent for plastic. And actually the person that made the patent was born in Belgium. So we start from there. But what we found out from literature, we found out that there are different topics there. So you see the colors. you see the colors and you see various clusters. So what is important for us when we go down the picture, so here, I don't know if it follows, yes, I'm there. So if I would go down this vertical axis, then we have human health related topics, which are for us are important one. There is environmental topics and so forth, but we focus on this one. And what we also have is that the colors are showing us what type of studies they also perform. So there is exposure pathways that they evaluated. They evaluated the chemical characterization. Those are the green ones. So we are somewhere there also that we are contributing with our work to the field. And then we wanted to see what is the micro and nanoplastics in food. What does it mean? And unfortunately, you don't see it, but I will try to put this one down. So what is important here, before I go and talk about micro and nanoplastics in food, we had to see and we have to talk about these exposure scenarios. And exposure scenarios can be infinite. And we developed even a tool which will help us to decide which exposure scenario to take into account. But this is just a simplified version of what we took into account. We took into account the food consumption databases that we had. We took account that we will have food, processed food and non-processed food, occurrence data, where they are coming from, because we were collecting seafood from 3 different regions. And then we also took into account how it was quantified. But you see, and then we start evaluating the data, and we also came up that polymer type is also very important. So if you go through this horizontally, or you do some kind of zigzag lines, then you have the different exposure scenarios. Yes. And then what we did, so what we learned when we took out all this data from the literature in 2023, then we could try to calculate what is the concentrations of microplastics in seafood. And what we found out, you see here clams, mussels, and oysters. That is what was mostly reported. You see it on the right-hand side. But also what is important is that number of articles that we managed to find at that moment. And what the concentrations, they were coming also, and they will be talked about today, but those are the concentrations of microplastic particles per gram of certain product. These numbers are important for us to calculate afterwards the exposure. And what is also on the right-hand side, because you don't see it now, but on the next click we will see it better, is that it shows the number of articles that we found, and also it shows the clams, mussels, and oysters. But also what you see different dots and different colors. So when we read these articles, we saw it, we could read directly. This is the original, the blue ones. But for some of the articles, we really had to put time in order to understand what kind of data they're reporting, and also to put them together in the graphs. So that's why we call them interpreted. But the other thing what you can see is also that for some of the seafood species, we have less results, but for some of them we have much more, and so forth. This is also important because our focus goes with either what we can easily learn or what is accessible, or maybe these mussels are also there because we can easily see the results. But what we notice as well is that need for harmonization jumped out. So the results are so diversified that it was really important for us to work with that. And also we notice as well, if we compare the results from some years ago and now, it's not easy to compare them because they measure different levels, different ranges of microplastics. So there are methods to align for this. We also tried to align and to measure and to come up with a number of microparticles that are comparable. When we try all of this, when we collect the data from our colleagues and partners on the concentrations, we start checking the exposure estimates. So what we managed to do, and what our colleagues also offered us, is that the micro and nanoparticles were measured in seafood and also in basil in some experiments that were actually contaminating the basil. And in all the estimates, we try to check for the children, adolescents, and adults. Those are the population that we are seeing and that we belong to. So what we do in exposure estimates, we make some kind of exposure scenarios. As I said, we go with average exposure scenarios or sometimes worst case scenarios. When we do not have a lot of data, we go with these worst case scenarios to scare and also to boost research to be really reliable, like in the beginning it was said, choose your model. But these are the results that you have to see. And again, these numbers here on the right-hand side actually are saying that there is certain range of microplastic particles per kilogram body weight per day. Still, it doesn't mean a lot. You have to see what is the person per day. So it comes around 1 microplastic particle per person. But this is coming from seafood. But we are exposed to microplastic particles through different sources. If you look at the basil, where we had to aggregate these exposures, so basil is a plant, but basil is used in pesto and so forth, we come to these green values, which is even less than 1 microplastic particles per person. But everything accumulates. That is this, it's not still mixture, but it's aggregated exposure that we have. But the most important maybe part for the humans and for the health is this totally right-hand side. There is no risk characterization because like when we work with contaminants, we have certain values and we can say, okay, below we are not, there is no health concern. Above that value, there is health concern. But for microplastics, we don't know. So even with this worst case scenario, we can say how much we are exposed, but we don't know what does it mean to our health. So that's why our colleagues and toxicology and so forth, they are working hard to make these values actually, or to come to the point that we can establish them. And then what I talked about now is that mostly a part about the food. So we focused on the dietary exposure. And especially in dietary exposure, because in the project we had this processed food and non-processed food, but also in food, microplastic comes also through environmental sources. But this is not enough. This is just one small part of the whole story and how we have to calculate the exposure. And how small it is, well, you see it here also, we took a part of this. So now we are on the pink ones. We took a part of the ingestion, but we didn't forget inhalation as well. Within Imptox, we also had inhalation exposure and the experiments were done as well. So some of our colleagues could talk more about this. And we are also trying to evaluate, to aggregate these exposures together. And then this one continues because this is just a small part. And then we have the different populations which are at risk, and so forth. But then we expand to much more details that are important when you are evaluating exposure assessment. But we are not stopping here. So everything that is important for exposure assessment, we try to map here. And there are a lot of small things that are actually bringing, each one of them is bringing a small puzzle piece to the big story on the micro nanoplastic exposure assessment. And then, so actually what I can give as a last one, I think, yeah, so we only thing what we don't see it is just simplified version of this map of how we call it of micro nanoplastic exposure assessment is that we have this characterization of micro nanoplastics. Why is it important for us for exposure assessment? Because we know which exposure scenario to take into account or which toxicological effects we have to look. For the data collection for us is also very important that is standardized because then we can put reliable data and comparable data. And then data analysis, which is really important as well. There we should integrate the data, and we also have to treat the uncertainties. Each of the exposure scenarios have certain uncertainties. So something that we cannot calculate at this moment. And then harmonization, I already said we noticed this. And then I said also that we are missing this health-based guidance values in order to see yes or no. And I finished there about the real-life scenarios, which we heard about, that is very important. And while Leanne is coming, just last one, to say that I'm thanking also people here, but also people that I unfortunately forgot to put on the slide. And some of them are also present here. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Marianne. We're going to save questions for the final speaker round. And with that, I'd like to invite our next colleague, Professor Dr. Andrea Rajkovic. He is a full-time research professor at the University of Ghent and is president of the International Committee for Food Microbiology and Hygiene, member of a number of further scientific committees. And without much further ado, I'd like to pass on the floor.
Right. So for the sake of time, I'll just run into the story immediately. It's all about interaction of microplastics and nanoplastics with whatever else we can find in the same matrix. And it's still a very simplified approach because we get exposed not in one single moment, but with a variety of moments, with a variety of channels. And that says that the vectors that we would like to investigate in conjunction with microplastics and nanoplastics is immense. So we had to make some choices. The choices we made, and you have seen from the first slide, really a lot of people were involved in this part of the project, was actually to start with something that we knew almost for sure that comes together at certain point and comes into our bodies through food or water. And the first co-contaminant, I would call it, that we investigated was the cyanotoxin, a group of toxins basically produced by blue-green algae. You have seen all those green, ugly layers on the fresh water systems all around the world. And sometimes you see those signboards saying, don't run around, don't play with your dog around it, and definitely don't swim or drink this water because it is dangerous. So given the fact that these toxins are really prevalent, and as the climate change worsens and the global warming becomes more intensive, this issue is going to be bigger. There is no doubt on that. The statistics have indicated that already. So what we did, we took some basil, right? And we grew it in a hydroculture in the water or the Holland solution, which is a nutrient spiked with these cyanotoxins. And we wanted to see if the cyanotoxin is there in different concentrations, will it actually end up in the plant itself? Because then it becomes a human hazard regarding food safety. We also did this on a much larger scale using lettuce, carrots, and strawberries. So semi-industrial production, as you can see in those huge greenhouses. And what did we see with basil? We saw that concentration-dependent uptake has been seen in the basil plants. The higher the concentration of cyanotoxins in the nutrient water, the higher the uptake was. And this was seen both in the leaves that we consume, either through pesto or as a spice on your pizza or your pasta. You grow it sometimes in your kitchen on the counter even, as well as in the roots. And these concentrations were quite high. Now we wondered what when the exposure of the plant stops and we put the plant now back to the clean water, will something change? What we did see is on the right-hand side with the red bars that the concentration decreased. Mind the size of the y-axis, right? So you see the concentration drops. It means the plant was giving it away. So there is a solution to the problem, at least when it comes to the roots. When you look at the leaves, not so much. The leaf doesn't get its chance during the shelf life of the product to get this toxin expelled. So if it is there, we will get exposed to it when we consume it. When we took a look at the lettuce, carrots, and strawberries, we did see that strawberries also, the fruit of the strawberries contain the cyanotoxin. So that's really no fun. That's one of the most popular berry fruits on the planet and certainly in Europe. So we did this kind of a back of the napkin exposure assessment. So what does it mean if people consume now these berries? And I'll just come to the conclusion that the kids, they are in a higher risk simply because of their low body weight. Right, almost 15% of the tolerable daily intake has been already consumed by the consumption of strawberries. So here we made a very clear assessment to ourselves, there is a problem. Now, we wanted to know if the nanoplastics, oops, I thought I removed this, but I did. Sorry. Okay, so I cannot solve this right now. We did expose basil to nanoplastics. Similar approach as with the cyanotoxins. And we wanted to see, are these very small particles made by University of Belgrade, are they going to be taken up into the basil plant? And yes, they were. There is no doubt nanoplastics is in the water. There is no doubt that nanoplastic is in the agriculturally used irrigation water, spraying water, even soil. So if it is there, it can be taken up in the plant. About 63% of the use concentration of nanoplastic has reached the plant. So clearly, basil can contain both the toxin and nanoplastics. We consume those basil plants and we get exposed to the combination of it. The question was, is this combination toxic more or less when we look into the individual components? To do this, I look at my fantastic researchers there on the upper rows of the room who did this fantastic work. And we did everything from the protein expression to the cell viability, mitochondrial activity, and then very much looking into every single aspect of the electron transport chain energy production. We did this, and I will make this rather complicated thing very simple to analyze. What do we see here, right? Looking just at the lower graphs. See, I will move from the camera for a moment. These three, and then these three, and all the other three bars, they represent the same concentration of nanoplastic and increasing concentration of cyanotoxins. And what you see is that for a given concentration of nanoplastics, toxicity does not change in function of added toxin. That means that all of the toxicity, or the vast majority of it, was coming from the nanoplastics. So the first three bars, that's a nanoplastic polystyrene of 1 microgram per milliliter. You go to the next three bars, we go to 5 micrograms per milliliter, and you immediately see the drop in the values. The drop indicates increased toxical effect. And you go to 10, you see it again. And that wasn't changing regardless of the present amount of toxin. So who was the culprit here? The nanoplastics. But on the left side, we look at intestinal cells. We do the same experiment with the liver cells, another organ. What we see that actually the amount of concentration of toxin was starting to play the role. The more nanoplastics, the bigger toxicity. The more toxin on the top of that nanoplastics, even bigger toxicity. That means that when you're trying to understand the health effects, it will be very different to which part of the body you're going to look at. Now, we moved, thanks to hard work of Aline, to the spheroids. We want to have a three-dimensional cell-based structure, something that better resembles the human organs. She produced this, she spiked the toxins on that, and the toxin this time we used was a cerulide, a very nasty toxin produced by a foodborne pathogen Bacillus cereus. Very hydrophobic one, obviously, because we wanted to look at those hydrophobic interaction with the plastics. What we did here, different concentrations of cerulide and different concentrations of microplastics in this case, both PP and PET. What we did find from all of these figures, I'll try to not to spend too much time showing you the colors, but you will notice that the only difference we basically see is this difference, right? And for the rest, differences are minor. Now, without going to argue why is this, I'm going to give a proposal what I think the thing is. The PP at the lowest concentration testis of 25 micrograms was giving the highest effect on toxin, and together with cerulide on the toxicity. When we increased the concentration of PP to 250, that effect was lower. And that's very strange, you would wonder. Now, with the PET, we saw none of those things. Basically, it was not as toxic. So what I think happened, at the low dose, these microplastics, so they're larger, they're not nanoplastics, they don't really do much on the cells, right? The toxin itself is the potent. Together, they did something. But now, because the PP is so hydrophobic, as Lian said, actually the higher concentration, the higher number of particles was actually scavenging the toxin and was not allowing the toxin to enter the cells. It was actually harboring on those microplastics. Now, if this idea is correct and our repetitions indicate that it is true, you might say that even to microplastics, especially the larger ones, there is something that we should consider a risk benefit. When you talk about nanoplastics, there is hardly any benefit. There is only risk, I think. With the larger pieces, they may actually work as the absorber. Now, there was, last night, put another slide here that I really put because Mirjana told me you don't have any conclusions. And the reason why I did not have any conclusions because the only conclusions I have is that we have learned so much that we only have even more questions. Our hunger to know more is becoming bigger. So this research is not stopping, right? This is a final event, but at the same time is also a start of something new. So we really want, at least me and my group really want to thank very hard to H2020, who funded Imptox, because I think we made a difference all together with that. In the light of that, I close it here and we save some time.
Thank you so much, Andrea. We will now come to our final speaker before the coffee break. We are going to eat into our coffee break just a little bit, but I think we managed to pick up some time. So I'd like to present Dr. Stephanie Badon. She's a CNRS researcher at the Center for Functional and Evolutionary Ecology in Montpellier. Stephanie.
Thank you. Okay. All right, maybe I start directly on this one and we save some time. I'm going to present the results we have obtained in the framework of Imptox about the potential for microplastics to be vectors for pathogenic and resistant bacteria. So there are about 400 million tons of plastics that are produced each year. And these plastics are degraded by different physical-chemical processes. And it's estimated that every year there are about 12 millions of tons of microplastics that are going into the ocean. So these microplastics, they are not spread equally around all the ocean. You have on the map on the right of the slide a model that is combining sampling, but also models of marine currents. And so you're seeing in orange, red zones, the places where it's estimated that the pollution by microplastic is the biggest. And you can see that the Mediterranean Sea is one of the hotspots for pollution by microplastics. These microplastics, they can be filtered by things that we are consuming as seafood, such as mussels, scallops, oysters, and clams. And you have here on the slide some numbers of estimate of the number of microplastics per individuals that have been collected. And so this is one of the ways how oceanic microplastics can enter the human body via the food chain and our digestive tract. They can also enter the human body via ocean spray and the respiratory tract. And these microplastics will have direct effects on our health, first by chemical and physical interactions between the particles and some of our cells. And we have already seen data about that. We'll see more in the second part of this conference. But I want to focus on some indirect effects that are coming through all what can adhere, all what can fix on the microplastics. Indeed, we have already heard a bit about that, but when a microplastics is in the seawater, it's going to be covered by a hard corona and then a soft corona that is constituted of organic material, but also there can be some heavy metals, for example, fixing on these particles. but the organic material is going to build a high nutrient content that is attracting bacteria. And some of the bacteria are going to fix, they are the first colonizer, and then more species of bacteria are going to come. And then there can be a full biofilm that is coating these microplastics. And if we zoom and we look at the species that are composing this biofilm that are formed on microplastics, some studies have found that some of them are among the pathogens and the biggest human pathogens. So for example, E. coli has been found in this biofilm, some Vibrio species, but also Pseudomonas species. And so the question is coming of whether these microplastics could be vectors for this pathogenic bacteria. So we have tried to start to answer a bit this question by two types of approaches. The first one is by looking at the composition of the microbial community that is associated to microplastics. And the second approach is by analyzing the genetic and environmental factors that determine how much a pathogen, and in this case, this is a fish pathogen, fixes to the microplastics. And I will try to give you the main results we have obtained by these two types of approaches. So regarding the composition of the microbial community associated to the microplastics, what we have done is to incubate different particle types into seawater. So these different particle types, they are different in many respects. So we have first microplastics that were produced by the lab of Lia Ann. So PP and PET particles that were produced by milling. So they are a kind of rough particle with a quite rough surface. We had polystyrene beads, so manufactured and very much more smooth. And we also used glass beads as a non-plastic control. Then we incubated at two geographical locations, so close to Ostend here in Belgium on the North Sea coast, and along the West Mediterranean coast of France. Within the two geographical locations, we had different sites that vary either by the salinity of the water or by the human activities around the incubation point. And for the incubation in the south of France, we also incubated at 3 different seasons to see the variation along the year. So the first result we have is that the microbial community that is associated to microplastic is different from the community of the surrounding waters. So of course there are species that are in common, but there are way less species on the microplastics than around. And that's true both in terms of the species presence absence, but also in terms of relative abundance. So the second result is that if we try to separate the factors that explain the variation in the composition of the microplastic, we have a strong effect of the incubation site. This makes sense because probably the bacteria that are on the microplastics, they are coming from around, and so the bacteria of the water column is also different around them. We have a moderate effect of the season. So the community is changing along the season, but much less than it's changing between sites. And we have no difference between support. So we have no difference between glass and plastics, and we have no difference between the 3 polymers of plastics. So it means, so it seems to me, it means that the plastics have nothing special in the composition of the community they are attracting, but they could still be a threat if they represent an addition of a huge surface area on which this bacteria can fix. So I think to go further in the assessment of the risk they represent in terms of carrying these bacteria, there is really a work to do about quantifying the microplastic particles and also relative to the other particles in the different locations. The third result is that the communities that are associated to these particles are richer in antibiotic resistance genes and virulence genes than the surrounding water community. And also we have huge disparities between incubation sites. And so just to give an example, we have a high diversity and abundance of antibiotic resistance genes in a sluice near Ostend, and on an oyster farm close to Montpellier. So now that we have this data, one very important thing is to assess directly, experimentally, the virulence of these bacteria that are associated to the plastic. It's not because you have bacteria with virulence genes that you can directly deduce that they are going to be virulent to human or to fishes or to plants, for example. And also, we have to keep in mind that the risk in terms of antibiotic resistance is not only the risk of the carriage, but also we know from other studies that biofilms are a place where bacteria exchange a lot of gene by horizontal transfer. So these communities can also be a place where the resistance genes are going from one species to another and potentially are reaching pathogenic species. Now, regarding the second approach, where we try to understand some of the factors determining the attachment of a fish pathogen to microplastics, we have used as a model of fish pathogen Vibrio angularum. We have gathered a collection of 16 strains that have been isolated all around the world in infectious context. And we have marked these bacteria with GFP, which allowed us to use image analysis to quantify the attachment to the microplastics. In a first experiment, we incubated pristine particles with our 16 strains marked with GFP. And the first results we have is that the attachment rate depends strongly on the support. So here we did the experiment only with PET, PP, and polystyrene. So you can see that there is a much more fixation on PET particles than on PP particles, and more on PP than on polystyrene. We think that it's partly explained by the difference in the physical properties of the particles. In particular, our polystyrene was polystyrene beads, which was way smoother than the other two particles. But you can also see on this slide that we have a huge variation, in particular for PP and PET. And so this variation is partly due to big differences between our 16 strains. And so there seems to be a strong intraspecific variability in the attachment rate to microplastics. We have fully sequenced all the genome of all the strains and tried to find a relationship with some genetic determinants. As for now, we have nothing that is really convincing. We are exploring other things, but I cannot go into details right now. So I think these results is meaning two things. First, it's difficult to assess the risk of microplastic as being vector of pathogenic species because we have this huge variation. But also it's stressing the point of to evaluate the risk, you cannot just measure the attachment of one strain and consider it's representative of the species. So that's I think that's a quite important finding. And finally, we also incubated with our GFP marked Vibrio angularum particles that had been field colonized before. So it's like putting together the two approaches I've mentioned before. And here the results are that Vibrio angularum is attaching less efficiently to field colonized PET and PP particles than to pristine particles. And the reverse for polystyrene beads. So Vibrio angularum is attaching more to the field colonized pH bead than to the pristine particles. So I think my interpretation of that is that the field colonization is kind of erasing the physical difference between the particles. And so now they're all coated with their biofilm and they kind of all look the same. But so when we compare to what they do to pristine particles, we have kind of this reversed effect. This also means that the potential for microplastics to be a vector for pathogenic species is going to depend on its colonization stage. And so to wrap up, I think we have kind of I would like you to keep three main messages. So first, the bacteria community associated to particles is a subsampling of the surrounding community, and it's enriched in antibiotic and virulence genes. The species and gene content does not vary with the support. And so probably the risk of microplastics depends on how much extra support they represent in the marine environment for this community rich in invariance and resistance gene to fix on. And finally, the attachment rate of a specific bacteria depends on genetic components that we haven't been able to identify right now, for now, but also strongly on the physico-chemical properties of the particle, including their colonization status, which is going to modify these physico-chemical properties. And so to finish, I would like to acknowledge all the people who have made this study possible, both within the project and outside, in particular, the people who made all the incubation and sampling possible, and you for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephanie, and thank you again for all the speakers this morning. I'd like to invite everybody to take a coffee now, and please be back here at 11 o'clock sharp. And don't forget Slido. If you have any questions, I will put the QR code back up onto the screen. Thank you.
In Southeastern Europe, rabbit pollen is very aggressive, and it is a cause of serious respiratory allergic conditions. It spreads from south to north quite quickly, and it is a huge ecological problem and, of course, a burden for health professionals. The rabbit pollen allergen so far recognized by World Health Organization and International Union of Immunological Society, the so-called the allergens that we know that are well characterized and put into the base of allergens, registered allergens. There are 11 of them, in fact, from MBA1 to MBA12. MBA2 is another isoform of MBA1. And in our previous studies, we have analyzed quantitative composition of allergens in different fractions of the pollen. The pollen itself can be analyzed as a water extract to look into the proteins that get into the water phase. You can also analyze the fraction of allergens that are formed from the burst of the pollen once in contact with water. These particles are called subpollen particles, and they carry certain allergens. And of course, you can analyze the total fraction of proteins if you use very aggressive means of extraction. This is more or less, you can see that the fractions and the composition of allergens are different. So in a way, we see some of the fractions that are very rich in the most dominant allergens, such as MBA1, that is a major allergen causing the Ig sensitization in almost 95% of patients. Other allergens of rabbit are not so dominant because they're frequently recognized in up to, let's say, 50–60% of patients, such as MBA11. You cannot see, this is displayed, but others are known as minor. Anyhow, all of them are relevant. If you want to make a component-based diagnosis, you need an area of allergens to really understand the reactivity of patients and to fine-tune the therapeutic strategies. So in our study design, we of course observed the corona formation. We started from a short exposure of pollen to water and made a protein extraction. Then we simulated the bronchoalveolar fluid for incubation to simulate the conditions occurring during the contact of the particles and the pollen in the lungs, in the bowel fluid. We use the nanoparticles. The sizes are in the nanometer range. The PET size was around 70 nanometers, and the PP was from maybe 100 to 900 nanometers, let's say. The median was around 150, if I remember well. But then we observed by scanning electron microscopy what occurs with the nanoparticles when they are dispersed with these extracted proteins after the short exposure. We analyzed corona after we extracted the hard and soft corona by proteomics and mass spectrometry. Then we identified proteins, protein hits. We cloned if we had, of course, the available gene sequences, and then we wanted to screen this reactivity with allergic patient serum. So if we look at the scanning electron microscopy of corona of ambrosia pollen extract, we can see that the PET particles, which are well dispersed in water, do not show different morphological behavior in the presence of ambrosia proteins. The PP particles that are a bit aggregated in the absence of proteins become a little bit more dispersed in the presence of ambrosia pollen. So it was an indication of the interactions. We have also analyzed the bulk proteins with the means of CT spectroscopy. The CT spectroscopy checks the protein structure. So we exposed the protein extract to the nanoparticles. We did the extraction of the unbound protein fraction, the so-called bulk, and we have seen that there are small but significant differences in the secondary structure of proteins, meaning that the binding of proteins to the nanoparticles seem to be selective, because if it's a non-selective binding process, then we would see no difference. It is just the excess, so we see a combination of all structures of all the proteins present in the X. If the bulk shows small but still significant differences in the content of certain structures, we can see that some of the proteins probably bind with higher affinity. And this is something we know because we have studied different proteins interacting with the nanoplastics. And but if we look at the corona itself that we analyzed by, first incubating the extracts and the plastics, separation of the particles by filtration from the bulk, then the soft corona. Soft corona are the proteins residing in the outer layer of this corona. They could be extracted with water. And the final step was the hard corona extraction. These are the proteins that are bound tightly to the plastic itself, to the particle itself, and you need to use very aggressive means to extract those proteins. These interactions are probably a combination of strong hydrophobic interactions, so we need a lot of detergents such as SDS and also to heat it up to 95 degrees to do the total denaturation. And then we analyze. So in the case of both particles, we have observed certain proteins residing in the hard corona. Then we have also observed that there is a difference in the intensity of the bands in hard corona and the soft corona. The PP particles, this is the soft corona, appear to be bound more in the soft corona, well, at least what we can see if we do the protein staining. But if we do the glycoprotein staining, we see that the hard corona of nano PP particles is rich in glycopeptides. Apparently, glycopeptides, the ones that we cannot stain with protein stains easily, but we actually see that they are here. And we have analyzed this. These are the fragments of many different proteins. But the most interesting for us was the IG binding. We used the pooled patient sera, and we have observed a clear and distinct proteins. It's not observable here, but in repeated experiments with more proteins isolated, we can see the same protein reactivity. Here are the allergens from this pool of patient sera residing in bulk and also in soft corona, and this is the hard corona. So it's very specific, very selective binding. Of course, we were curious. We wanted to analyze by mass spectrometry the identity, and we found two hits. So the first one is the protein PCC1362-like protein of Ambrosia artemisifolia, and the second hit is a plant-based secretory protein family of Helianthusans. It means that there are no genes, proteins so far sequenced and known in the database of Ambrosia, so we expect a homologue in Ambrosia. Then for the protein, the PCC1362, we have done some search. So this is for this protein, there is evidence only at the transcript level. It is not known at the protein level, at least according to the UniProt Tremble database. However, we have seen in one of the publications that a group of authors investigating the temperature responses on the expression of genes in Ambrosia observed this protein, PCC, and they have even seen that it reacts with the patient's IG, but they did not follow this investigation. It was not in their focus. So this is a protein relatively acidic. The other protein is a highly basic protein, and the evidence of its existence is very low. It's just predicted, even for this common sunflower. So this protein is believed to be part of the plant's defense mechanism against pathogens. And for the PCC13 protein, people believe that it's a desiccation-related gene. It's believed to be important for resistance to desiccation. And according to interpro function, it is interesting, it has some peroxidase-like activity, and it binds pigments. So why did we see these proteins for the first time? We have been studying ambrosia allergens since, I don't know, 2010. We have done the complete proteome of ambrosia back in 2017. So we now analyze the data from that study. And quite interestingly, now this protein is on the top. It means that 10 years ago, or 7 years ago, it was not in the database. So it was there, but because no database hit, we could not see it. So it's quite relevant. And both proteins are actually there. So it's not a new protein that now appeared in the proteome. It was there, just it was not in the database, so we could not identify it. So we cloned the protein, the recombinant PCC13, because we wanted to check its reactivity with the patients, and we have observed in 9 investigated patients that around 50% of all patients react positively to this protein. We have also analyzed in parallel the hard corona proteins, and we have observed that 100% of proteins react positively to the hard corona proteins. So the hard corona of both PT and PP is probably composed of both proteins, and they contribute differentially. We also believe that the other protein that we could not clone because the gene sequence is not available is probably highly relevant and major allergens, and it is something, of course, to do in a follow-up study. So yes, we have indeed confirmed this because we did a 2-dimensional immunoblot analysis of the hard corona around the nano-PET particles. So these are the proteins stained, and this is the IG binding. We see these proteins in the basic region, and we confirmed its identity to be the plant basic secretory protein, probably another major allergen beside PCC that we will that we have actually analyzed here. So we can conclude that there is a highly selective binding of rabbit proteins to nanoplastics. We have investigated 2 kinds of nanoplastics. They differ physicochemically. The nano-PET is a little bit more acidic. Yeah, it's more aged, not so naturally because of the production process. The nano-PP is highly hydrophobic. We observed very specific interactions, and we have mapped novel allergens that were hidden so far in previous studies. We could say that there is apparently an enrichment of specific proteins, specific allergens on particles of respirable size that we have confirmed in our study. So thank you all. Any questions? You can use slide.
Thank you very much, Tanya. And now we'd like to move to the next speaker. Our next speaker is Mohammed Ali Moussaoui from the KU, or Catholic University in Leuven. And I'm going to hand over the stage. Thank you.
Oh. Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming here today. As usual, it's a pleasure meeting you all. As you have seen from my colleagues, partners in this work, microplastics are a pressing issue that needs to be addressed as soon as possible. From Stephanie's work, from Leanne's work, from Andrea's work, from Tanya's work, you saw that these particles behave like vectors for pathogens. They behave as transport agents for a lot of things that harm us, harm marine life, harm plants. And they found their way to our food chain, to our respiratory system, to our digestive system in many different ways. So in collaboration with the team Leanne, who was so generous to synthesize the particles, to make them, she sent them to Stephanie, who was also kind to incubate them and share some of them with us. The particles that we received were incubated at 3 different sites. Well, this says the bassin d'eau, like the Tow Lagoon, where there is an oyster farm, there's a natural park, and a harbor. The particles that were incubated there are mainly polypropylene and polyethylene terephthalate, because these are the widely spread particles from things that we use on a daily basis, like food wrapping, like telephone cases, bottles, and so on. So we wanted to check if these microplastics have another effect on our life, like can they interact with metal ions or metals in water? Because these metal ions have a lot of toxicity towards our health, and then they can affect the liver, the heart, the respiratory system, the digestive system, and so on. But the first question that you might ask is like, why do these microplastics absorb metal ions, or if they do that? Well, these microplastics can have functional groups on their surface, and these functional groups can aid in coordinating these metal ions, allowing them to be entrapped on the plastisphere around the plastic. They have polarity and different charges. They have rough surfaces, mainly from wear and tear, from weathering, and so on. And the absorption kinetics from like the between the metal ions or the metal ion complexes and these plastics in solution. Other conditions, the environmental conditions such as pH, temperature, and the presence of organic and biological matter like proteins, allergens, and so on can affect these interactions. So initially we chose to work on these polypropylene and polyethylene terephthalate particles. As you can see, the PET has carbonyl groups that can aid in the absorption or like the binding of metal ions through coordination or ion-like model bonds. On the other hand, polypropylenes are like a chain of CH chains that do not have this or do not possess these functional groups. So we received these particles, we isolated them, dried them, and checked their morphology under SEM or scanning electron microscopy. And as you can see, the polyethylene terephthalate on the right, polyethylene terephthalate on the right, they appear to be smoother from the outside, while the polypropylene appears to be rough. So although the particles of polyethylene terephthalate possess these functional groups that can bind the metal ions, the roughness of the surface on the polypropylene can create these microenvironments that will allow the metal ions to be embedded there. Although on a microscopic level they appear smooth enough, on a microscopic level they are not. After checking the morphology, we decided to do an elemental mapping on these plastics and check if there is any metals present on them. And for no surprise, we should be able to see the carbon chain, which, as you can see from red here, it is present in both. The oxygen is present on polyethylene terephthalate, which also comes from the structure. But we saw other elements there. We saw metal ions like copper, iron, and aluminum. What was more interesting is in the case of polypropylene, we found that, can I hide this? Yeah. As you can see, there is the same print of magnesium and oxygen on this side on polypropylene. It means that the particle, the metal magnesium is present on this particle as magnesium oxide. And this can be due to the fact that farmers at the oyster farm use magnesium oxide as a supplement for the oysters, for their shell hardening. So although we are adding these metal ions for a good purpose, they are being absorbed on these plastics, and they are reaching our food chain through the oysters that we consume. So we moved to the other locations like the harbor and the natural reserve, and we tested the particles again. But this time we decided to go to more quantitative analysis. We used ICP to determine the elemental composite, determine the metal adsorbed or the quantity of the metal adsorbed on these particles. We had the glass beads as a control, again from Stephanie and her team, and then we used the polypropylene and polyethylene. As you can see, the glass beads had no no absorption or little to no absorption of the metal ions on their surface. This contradicts with what Stephanie and her team saw on them being a vector for pathogens. Because in this case, the particles, the microplastics, can form a corona of these biomaterials present in the water bodies, and then these corona can also absorb metal ions, or like make environments that are suitable for the absorption of metal ions. You can see like a huge amount of aluminum adsorbed on the polypropylene and the polyethylene terephthalate particles at the marine reserve. This can be due to the incubation of these particles close to a buoy in the water, which from the wear and tear from weathering conditions, these plastics can absorb metals like aluminum that comes from the surrounding environment. On the other hand, the absorption of manganese appears to be higher at the harbor, which can be from different conditions, from paints on the boats in the harbor, from a lot of waste that is thrown there at the harbor. So now we wanted to go to a more controlled environment in a lab, on a lab scale. We wanted to incubate these microplastics with food allergen, with microorganisms, and with respiratory allergens. These have been chosen for their like significant importance in our studies. For example, the beta-lactoalbumin is beta-lactoglobulin is a food allergen, and then when we incubated the particles with beta-lactoalbumin, we first incubate them for a longer period, like around 24 hours, to ensure that the corona or like these films around the microplastics form. And then after that, we isolate the particles and incubate them with different methods. In this case, we present some of the data that we collected. But it is evident that there is no effect, or not a huge effect, of the incubation or the presence of these biofilms around the particles on the absorption of metal ions. This also suggests that now we have this particle that is causing a dual threat. One is from the allergen itself that is absorbed because we are sure that there is biofilms. We also observe that under SEM and TEM imaging. And then there is the manganese, there is the metal ions that are absorbed on it. So this particle now behaves as a vector, as a pathogenic vector of what? Pathogens from bacteria. In the second stage, we'll see that, of allergens and of metal ions. And in collaboration with the team of Andrea Rajkovic at Ghent University, Maxime went there, and then he incubated the microplastics with bacteria. And then the incubation this time has to be, the particles should be exposed for a longer period, so that is about a week, before you incubate them with the metal ions. And then we see also there is not a huge effect aside from for lead. In this case, lead has like a specific case because it might have been absorbed with the proteins, because there is the brine that is used to allow the bacteria to survive in solution. And then that can form complexes with these, and then this will affect the binding of it on the plastics or not. In the third attempt, we tried to use that in combination with the respiratory allergen, which was ambrosia that Tanya just spoke about. And then in this case, again, there is not much effect, but for lead, there is a difference, like there is a huge difference, which can be due to the fact that lead has a tendency, as a soft metal, has a tendency to bind to the cysteine or like sulfur groups in proteins. So this was what affected the binding of the lead on the microplastics. So in the end, we have shown that metals absorb onto microplastics, although they don't have the specific binding sites for microplastics. They still, for metal ions, they still manage to absorb these metal ions into them. And metals, bacteria, and proteins can be simultaneously present around the microplastics in this corona or plastisphere that is around these particles. And this is what makes them a dual threat, because they behave as a transport agent or as a vector for all these pathogens that affect us. And biomolecules might facilitate or hinder the metal binding depending on their affinity. This was evident from the binding of lead. If lead has a higher affinity to bind to a protein and complex and settle down, it will not be absorbed from the metal. on the particles, but if the metal does not have a specific binding site on a protein, it will be absorbed. Finally, as we said, it is the take-home message. These microplastics need to be addressed because they pose a dual threat. They are a vector for pathogens, for metals, for a lot of allergens, and they are present everywhere. They found their way to our everyday life. Finally, I'd like to thank everyone who collaborated on this work, and especially Stephanie, Leon, Tanya, and Andrea's team. Thank you again.
Thank you so much, Mohammed. So I'd like to invite our next speaker. This is Dr. Marianne van Hagen. She is a professor of clinical immunology at the Department of Medicine and the Division of Immunology in the Karolinska Institute. So, Marianne.
Thank you. So, dear all, it's a great pleasure, I should say, to be part of the Imptox travel during the years now. And today we would like to present what we have obtained, the results so far. And we all know, we have heard about all the plastic that we are surrounded with, but what does it actually do with the immune system? And this is what has been our task. So this is actually to understand how do these micro nanoparticles actually with allergen and without allergen interact with the immune system. So we have had 4 tasks. The first is for, we have evaluated acute cytotoxicity. This has been reported. The second task has been for antigen-presenting cells. These are the first cells that interact with the antigen when it comes into the immune system. This has also been reported. I will show you the data. And then the third task has actually been, how does these particles with or without allergen actually affect the transport through epithelial barriers? And this has also been reported. And today we are at the final stage, and I think the most important and interesting stage, and that is the humoral response and effector cells in actually allergic disease. And I will start, and Daniela Apostolowicz will continue. So the first task then was acute cytotoxicity. We have obtained several different particles from our collaborators, both from Belgrade, we have obtained from Diane, and also from Plastic Face, and also from Andrea. So the good news is actually that most of the plastic particles do not induce an acute cytotoxicity at environmental relevant doses. However, we had some problems with in vitro culture conditions that could affect actually the data that, for instance, could be SDS, and that's added then to additional uncertainty. And this is what we have published, or it is Tanya, who was the lead, and we were part of this publication. We found we need to know actually what is the dose that is delivered to the cells. I mean, one dose you administer, but what is the dose actually that is delivered? And we found that only 10% of the dose that we give to the cells are actually delivered to them. And knowing this, we could then continue with the other tasks, and we performed them with corona formation on MNPs and stimulation. The second task was then the antigen-presenting cells. These are the most important cells in the immune system, or the first cells that we are encountering for the allergens. So what we found then that NPAT, with or without allergens, they are taken up in a dose-dependent process. Interestingly, we found that there was a slightly higher uptake of NPAT with allergens by these antigen-presenting cells than by allergen alone. And here you can see that they are taken up in a higher way And we had 3 different allergens. We used 2 food allergens, tropomycins, and we used the beta-lactoglobulin and 1 respiratory allergen, and that was the ragweed allergen. And we also noticed that a single dose of pristine nanopads, both with or without allergen, did not actually change the fate of the presenting cells. So we then analyzed the co-stimulatory factors. Are they activated? How do they look? And we also looked then at the inflammatory genes, and we found no, that there was no change. The third one was actually to see how does it affect epithelial barriers. And here we used the cockatoo cells, which is then reflecting the gastrointestinal tract. So we saw then that it had an effect. An effect of MNPs was noted in our chronic and repetitive dose scenario. And this is shown here. We started to look then in this chronic model, where you can see they have been differentiated, these cockatoo cells, for 17 days with inserts, then with and without allergen, and then we had a chronic exposure where the cells were exposed to the PETs, the NPET, every second day for around 40 days. And what you can see here is then when we have this chronic exposure, and this is actually reflecting the exposure that we are exposed to every day. It's not a single exposure, it's chronic exposure. And then we can see that it has an effect on the permeability of the gastrointestinal tract. We also wondered, of course, what could this depend on, this permeability? And one test was to look, is it depending on cytotoxicity? And here you can see that it is, that the cells, they were more toxic after this chronic exposure. So the transport of food allergens was actually greatly affected by chronic exposure. And I don't show that figure, but we have done experiment, making actually the monolayer more leaky. And that, of course, increases sensitization as well as allergic responses. So now the final task, which Daniela will continue, which is actually the allergic responses. And here we have measured IgE, and you know IgE is the most important marker in allergy. That's the marker for sensitization. And also you look at IgE, knowing if there are symptoms, then we have allergic disease. This is not the only marker. You can also have a question when you have patients, is this allergen source actually causing a release, activating the basophils in the human system? Because the basophils, activation of them, that's the cause why we have symptoms. So Daniela will tell us all about how these experiments went on. We did that in 2 different systems. We did it in the human system with basophils. We also used the rat basophils. So we did it in 2 systems. And finally, we also wanted to know how does this affect actually the immune system, the cells. And of course, this is not what you do in everyday clinics, but experimentally you want to know, because the T cells, they are the ones that start the process. So Daniela, tell us about the good results.
Yes, thank you, Marianne. Thank you. So as Marianne said, so in the last task, we actually evaluate what is the IgE binding capacity of the allergen that has been found on plastic, and what is the allergenic activity, or is it possible to induce mediator release in the effector cells, which are mast cells and the basophils, and what is happening with other immune cells. So firstly, we needed to make nanoplastic allergen corona and to characterize it to know exactly which allergen is there and how much is it to have a reference period. And this is well known, goes with the title of this presentation, the allergic response to allergen MNPs. So the first experiments that we performed was to assess allergenic activity of hard corona with bovine lactoferrin and soft corona with the bovine lactoferrin with plastic, and without plastic. And we done that by basophil activation test. This assay is used in the clinic also to assess if there is a sensitization or allergic response truly, and you need to do it by fresh patient material using the patient blood, where you incubate with different or increasing dose of the allergen concentration or antigen concentration. Then you label specific biomarkers, which are for the basophils, and you follow them by flow cytometry if they are activated or not. So bovine lactoferrin is the one allergen that has single allergen epitope called carbohydrate epitope alpha-gal that is very important in mammalian type of food allergy called alpha-gal syndrome. And we used basophil activation assay with soft and hard corona of this protein to test allergenic response. What we noticed is that in all 3 patients that so far we received, allergenic activity of soft and hard corona with bovine lactoferrin is higher than allergen alone. And as I said, this is a single epitope, which means sometimes, and this is a carbohydrate epitope, so sometimes steroid hydrolysis can occur that you cannot get activation. But in case of hard or soft corona, you probably have cluster or aggregates and the epitopes are more exposed, which means you have more enhanced allergic response. So furthermore, we also investigate other food allergen sources like cow's milk allergy. As Mohammed says, beta-lactoglobulin is one of the major cow's milk allergy and has several protein epitopes that IgE binds from the mineral allergic patients. So first, we actually evaluate IgE binding capacity of hard corona with beta-lactoglobulin. And what we notice is that, of course, in those response, we see IgE binding, IgE inhibition with allergen is pretty much similar. That is in form of hard corona or allergen alone. But there is also a variety of epitope exposure because with the lower doses of hard corona, you have a bit lower inhibition of IgE binding. In order to see if this is fitting well with the bovine lactoferrin, we also assess allergenic activity of hard corona with beta-lactoglobulin. But in this case, we done it in vitro culture where we had basophils, humanized basophil cell lines that were sensitized with IgE from the patients in sera, and then we actually stimulate them with a hard corona allergen only. We had 5 milk allergic sera, from which 1 was beta-lactoglobulin IgE negative. And we didn't saw here activation or mediator release in that case. But in other patients, 4 patients that they had IgE to beta-lactoglobulin, we actually notice again that allergenic activity or mediator release with hard corona is higher than beta-lactoglobulin. And in this case, if you have multi-epitopes and you have aggregates, this could be, or there are novel epitopes, or this is more again enhanced response because other epitopes are also exposed to the other IgEs that are specific. Of course, you are never exposed to the single protein or single epitope. You're always exposed to the mass of everything. And as Ian says, you have to have a holistic approach. I don't have other environmental exposure except the birch pollen in my in vitro assays, but we can say that actually it contributes that you're exposed to the several allergens and several or multi-epitopes. So here we used birch pollen extract to make hard corona with nanoplastic, and we also assessed it on IgE ELISA. We also noticed that actually there is a lower inhibition with hard corona in ELISA than with the allergen only. This could reflect that actually due to assay that is on the plate, you don't have enough surface to reach the IgE binding. And since the ELISA is not a quantitative way to measure IgE reactivity, we actually use the immunocapsid methodology that is used every day in clinical settings, where you actually measure IgE level to the specific allergen. And in this case, we made full birch pollen extract corona, and we measure IgE levels to the major BETV allergen, as we already, with Tanya, found that BETV1 allergen is on hard corona, and as well to the birch extract, using, of course, birch allergic patients. What we found is that there is a slight, when we pre-incubate sera with hard corona with birch extract or with birch extract, we see that actually remaining IgGs binding is pretty much similar between hard corona and birch extract. But of course, we also see a bit slight binding to plastic only from the serum IgG. We also assess this in vitro assay for allergenic activity, and we actually saw pretty much similar results as for the beta-lactoglobulin and beta-lactoferrin, where we saw allergenic activity of hard corona for birch extract was higher than birch extract only. However, in this assay, we actually saw in some patients that mediator with that plastic only occurs in some concentration, which can have confounding effects of this assay and can mask real allergenic activity. And finally, we actually wanted to see what's happening with other immune cells, or specifically with T cells, if you stimulate PBMCs of allergic and healthy donors with hard corona or birch extract only, and we evaluated this by following the activation marker of T cells, CD69. What we noticed is that micronanoplastic with allergen activates the cells more than birch extract or nanopad, but this was not specific for the healthy or allergic control. It activates both CD4 and CD8 cells, but there is no difference between healthy and allergic patients, which could be actually discussed that this could be also in sensitization. So to conclude, most of the plastic particles that we evaluate do not induce acute toxicity at one exposure in environmental relevant concentration. But MNPs do affect the monolayer integrity by making the monolayer more leaky, which increases the allergen transport, the uptake of the allergen and presentation to antigen-presenting cells, the T cell activation, which could lead to inflammation, sensitization, or higher allergic response. And what we also saw is that IgE potency of MNPs with allergen is also almost the same as the allergen, but the allergenic activity of allergen is highly increased by MNPs, which enhance the allergic response, which all in all says that MNPs as carrier as allergen could augment the allergic response. I would like to thank all of our group that has participated in this research, and of course, all our collaborators by Imptox. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Daniela. So we'd like to move on to our next speaker. Now I'd like to invite Michelle Epstein from the Medical University of Vienna. She is at the Department of Immunology and will talk about
Dermatology.
Dermatology. It's not listed here. Thank you very much, Michelle.
No problem. Right, so the penultimate talk. We have heard a lot about the overview, the problem with plastics or potential problem with plastics. We've heard a lot about the character of the plastics that we're using in this project, something about what the character of the plastic interaction with the environment is like. And now we're going to move towards the health effects. In this talk, I'm going to be discussing our role in the project, which is to examine the effect in mouse models. Our hypothesis was, as you already have been informed during the last few lectures, is that the microplastics or nanoplastics could combine with allergens and could trigger and make allergies a lot worse. And not only make allergies a lot worse for people who have allergy, but increase the number of people who will develop allergies. And this is a major problem, a major concern for us. Why do we think this in the first place? Well, partially because the route for the plastics and for allergens is basically the same, right? You inhale them, or you ingest them, or you might have contact through the skin, or even a, say, systemic response, intravenous exposure. So Why are we interested in this at all? Well, allergies are on the rise. We don't know why they're on the rise. We have lots of hypotheses for that. But one hypothesis is that we've increased the amount of plastic in the environment, the amount of nano and microplastics in the environment. And this is a potentially concomitant increase in both. And so could it be that these plastics are increasing the chances of people being sensitized and for their normal allergic responses to be worse? So the problem with studying this and trying to figure out whether this hypothesis is correct or not is that it's challenging to study this in humans. And why is it challenging? Well, our hypothesis states that this is bad. So if it's bad, do you want to give it to people to make them feel, get worse? Have their allergies get worse, become sensitized. So doing it in patients is unethical. The other issue is that we don't have a chance to really understand the deeper biological implications because we can only look at blood, we can look at superficial cells that are easy to extract from patients and individuals, and we can get excretions. But in mouse, we can give different doses of plastics and we could look at all of their organs and all of their tissues and try to understand what the mechanisms of these particles are, where they go, where they stay, perhaps over the long term. All of that's possible in a mouse model. So our objective in the project was really to determine whether the impact of the particles that we're using, made of PP and PET, all of you have heard about them already, do they influence model of allergic asthma and food allergies and systemic immunization in experimental animal models? So what we did was a series of experiments. This is just sort of a broad overview in which we did an inhalation type model and the animals received ragweed pollen to be as real world as possible with different doses of the PET or PP that were given to the animals with and before and after we administered the ragweed pollen. And in this case, what we would expect is to see a normal pollen-induced allergic asthma, and we would be able to determine whether adding the particles would increase the severity of the disease. In our experiments in the inhalation part, we try to be as real world as possible. Our doses are not exorbitant. Now, there are many papers in the literature in which people have given huge doses of the particles and overwhelmed the system. But what we decided to do was get an idea of what a normal exposure would be like based on respiratory rate and calculate and translate it to the mouse and give the mouse a dose. And we have 3 doses that we gave them, but give them doses that made more sense, not the worst case scenario where, in fact, even if we did see a response, we wouldn't know whether it was real. And so we've done that experiment. We've done ingestion experiments in which we've given a food allergen, egg whites. Sorry, the picture didn't show up here, but a chicken, egg, protein, in the animals ingested with and without the particles. I won't be showing those data today, but we've also done a model in which we inject the particles so that they spread systemically in the circulation, and we can get an idea of how the animal responds to a pure protein like egg, chicken egg protein, or shrimp tropomyosin, which is Both are allergens, both are human allergens. So our readouts are basically antibody responses. Do the animals develop an antibody response? What do their tissues look like in histology? We take out the cells and we examine their immune responses. We also have done tracking experiments in which we can deliver the particles, the animals inhale them, and we can follow fluorescently labeled particles. And the first slide I'd like to show you is exactly that. So in the panel on the left, you see a healthy response. This is lung. The blue dots represent cells, and the green spots are the fluorescently labeled particles. So in the healthy animal, after 1 week, after they inhale 1 dose, they have particles around the airways. So where you see this nice pattern, this is the airway, and you see particles around the airway. But what's really interesting is when the animals have allergic asthma, they have had a few doses, in fact, 6 doses of ragweed pollen, and they have an inflammatory response. You see sort of get a gestalt that there's more blue cells over there than blue cells in the left panel, and you see a lot more particles. Now this is after 1 week, 1 dose of the particles after 1 week, and you see that there's more there and that they're still there after a week. The next slide, I'm just showing you the antibody response, and I have just made it easier to appreciate the results. There's a naive animal, an animal that just received the particles, an animal that just received ovalbumin, which is the allergic A protein, and the ovalbumin with the particles. So on the left side it's PET, on the right side it's PP, and what you can see is that the filled squares are higher than the open circles. When you give PET alone, it looks like the naive animal. So there was no response to the antigen. On the right panel, what you can see is that there seems to be no response from the PP. Now, in this case, we've done an injection into the abdomen. This is a peritoneal fluid. And what we can see is once we deliver the antigen or the allergen into the abdomen, an immune response develops. And we see that in a naive or a healthy animal, in both cases, there's not very much going on. When we add the particles, the PET particles, however, we do see that there's a response, that these animals develop an eosinophilic or an allergic response, which is a little bit interesting because there's no allergen, and yet it still drives this allergy response. When you give them the protein, a foreign protein, they develop a response, and it appears that they have a higher response when you give the PET particles, although it's not significant. It's not statistically significant, and it is just a trend. And this is based on the fact that the animals, there's a high variability here, and it's possible that if we do another few experiments and add numbers to these experiments of animals, then we would see some statistical significance. In the case of polypropylene, we do not see any effect alone. We do see a little bit of an increase when it's added to the protein, but it seems that once again, it's not statistically significant, which is good news. In this case, we're looking at eosinophils on the left panels, and on the right panels, we're looking at neutrophils. Eosinophils are the type of white blood cell that's important for the allergic response. That's what you see when you develop an allergic response. On the right side, the neutrophils are a normal white blood cell response that you get to a bacteria when you cut your hand. These cells are very important in these responses, but not allergic usually. So in this case, we're looking at an inhalation protocol in which the animals were received ragweed pollen with or without the particles. And we could see that just giving PET or PP alone doesn't boost the eosinophils in this assay, which is different than the assay I just showed you before. So PET alone was able to do something, but when it's inhaled, it wasn't able to do something. And I want you to keep that in mind for the next slides. Ragweed pollen with and without plastic particles are the same, and basically the same for a polypropylene, although there is a difference in the level with polypropylene, and there's a statistical significance with polypropylene for eosinophils, whereas it was the opposite for the other. So for neutrophils, we see quite an impressive response to PET particles alone. So this is interesting that now in one case you administer in one way and it drives the eosinophils. You administer it in another way and it drives neutrophils, which is a different type of immune response. And in this case, we see an increase, a modest increase when it's added to the ragweed pollen, and interestingly, a decrease when polypropylene is added to it. So this is kind of messy. Things are not what we expect, and they're a little bit hard to understand because they are doing different things, and it's challenging. Now, why is it so challenging? Well, the next two slides I'm going to talk about why this is challenging and probably not unlike the early experiments with PM 2.5 and 10. All of these things play a role in what happens in the immune response. So the particle type, the host, the cargo, as you've already heard, the exposure, as I mentioned, exposure, cell interaction and uptake, as you heard just before. Now, these are the main categories, but in fact, it is way more complicated. So when we're talking about the particles, we're not only talking about the composition of the particle, we're talking about the shape of the particle, the numbers of the particle, the size of them, whether they aggregate, whether they've been exposed to UV, whether the surface charge is hydrophobic or hydrophilic, whether there's contaminants, stabilizers, plasticizers, are they oxidized? Are they biodegradable? Are there flame retardants? Is the host different? Is there a microbiome different that will change and influence the immune response, for example? The type of dendritic cell population that's uptaking, as we heard before, that could be different. Is there a difference in the cargo? So airborne cargo, endotoxin, heavy metals, microbials of all sorts, allergens, biofilms, all of this is going to increase or change how the immune response develops. The exposure route, are you eating it? Are you drinking it? Or is your, is contact in skin? Is it systemic? Is it inhaled? Is there a diluent effect? Is there a dispersion problem, delivery of timing before, after the allergen, for example, and the uptake in epithelium, the cell type, the biodistribution, as we saw already, changes. Now, I will just point out one example that we're dealing with. I mean, and besides size, number, change in the composition, but imagine that you're inhaling this stuff. Is it possible that 100 particles go to 5 cells, or that 100 particles go to 100 cells? I mean, you have absolutely no idea. And the number of particles going to those cells being uptake taken up by those cells is going to change how that cell initiates the whole immune response. So with that, I'd like to just conclude that we tried this with real world dosing. I think that our changes in the immune responses are modest with these doses, and that's good news. We've done tracking experiments, and we see that the particles reside in the lungs for longer than we expected. We have some longer term experiments in which I didn't show the data yet, and we have some experiments with C13 particles that we are still analyzing. The immune responses I've just discussed is completely dependent on all those factors. And it is very, very complicated to reduce the model so that we can really gather the information that we need. I think that the good news is that we don't have terrible effects with the particles. The bad news is that over time, with chronic exposure, with different mixes of different sizes, different shapes of particles, that we may see differences in the immune response and effects on allergic asthma. So I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done. So I'd like to thank everybody who is involved with the project and my lab, Leanne and her team at University of Vienna, Tanya and her team, and I'd like to thank ChatGPT for helping me with the images.
Okay, thank you very much. So we come now to our final speaker. So I'd like to introduce Mariana Turkali from the University at the Children's Hospital. Sorry.
And also University.
And also University in Zagreb. So thank you very much.
Thank you for the opportunity to be with you today. I would actually present my lecture from the clinical point of view because on the first place I'm a clinician. I think it's in a different corner when we are talking of the same problem. So for a start, I would like just to remind you, and also you saw this slide in the first lecture, that allergic disease are very prevalent, the most prevalent disease in the children, and also European Academy of Allergy and Allergy and Clinical Immunology recognize as an allergic disease and make a specific policy how we deal with this problem today. And because the epidemiological point of view and allergic disease are very prevalent in European countries, and you also can see here a lot of persons suffer from allergic disease, and important things that we can expect and more allergic persons, not just the kids, and also in the older population is also a problem. And what is the reason for that? We are trying to answer. So I will just point two allergic diseases. Is on the first place in food allergy, and the second some respiratory allergies with the allergic asthma is a specific allergic disease, very complex. I already heard that is for food allergy, and now we know a lot of factors which have an influence of the development of allergic diseases and predisposed and susceptible persons, and which of these factors is more important than other. Maybe is the different story for different persons. We actually don't know. I think the personalized approach will be more important in the future, and is not easy to put all together for one size. When we're talking about respiratory allergy, especially allergic asthma, as I already mentioned, a lot of also factors already recognized. I will just focus on environmental factors which are related with the westernized lifestyle and which are we know have a huge impact on the development of the respiratory allergic diseases. And some of these probably and important factors are related with the exposure to micro and nanoplastics. So you will see how we actually can connect that relationship in our clinical studies. I already said that we will focus on the respiratory and gastrointestinal tract. When we're talking about the respiratory tract, it's important to know that the effects will be different, just related with the size of the particles which are going through the respiratory tract. And already Michelle pointed that for instance, one size here will be have the major effect on the upper respiratory tract, but a small particle, especially nanoparticle, will be more effects on the lower respiratory tract, and especially on alveolar compartment of our respiratory tract. And we know that translocation of these particles and also penetration of these small particles have an impact on the not just on alveolar epithelia and also on some inflammatory cells in intra-alveolar septa and also in other organs which are reached from alveolar membrane transportation. So in asthma, now we know that an important effect on micro and nanoplastics on inflammation, on redox imbalance, and also effect on the damage of epithelia barrier or dysfunction. And we know that these effects have direct effects on the some inflammatory cells. And now we know, this is the result from the animal model, that for instance, ROS production, inflammatory cytokines and chemokines, and also inflammatory all inflammatory response are directly related with the exposure to some PP particles in animal model. For us, it's very important to know that these effects actually start very, very early during the prenatal period and also in the first years of life and also in the school years of life. Why is that period is very, very important for us? Because during that period, we know that the maturation of the immune response is the dominant period. And we also, if we want to intervene on the inflammatory response, I think it's important to start with the intervention very early. It's important to recognize which or what components have a huge and the most important effects of the development of the allergic diseases, on the development of allergic symptoms, or on the development of the for instance, progression of the allergic disease, or for instance, exacerbation in already allergic persons. So when we're talking about the effects of the MNPs on the gastrointestinal tract, it seems that ROS activation, it seems the very, very important role, not just through alteration of gut microbiota, but also on the activity of some cells in gastrointestinal tract, in the synthesis of the inflammatory cytokines, development of some dysbiosis or changes of some metabolic components. that is one theory. The other one, it's also that all of these changes, which are related with some measurable changes in some patient with already allergic diseases, it's actually having a gut microbiota, and gut microbiota changed their diversity, mucus secretion, or some inflammatory potential, and also all of these, for instance, factors actually changed and point that these changes actually can effect on the development of the sensitization, after that in sensitized persons, on maybe on the development of some allergic diseases. Now we know that the many particles, you heard that, are having influence, that epithelial barrier theory, it seems, having the most prevalent impact, especially damage of epithelium, not just in lung, gastrointestinal tract, and also maybe in other tracts, for instance, in the skins, and how this damage have an influence on the development of food allergy, we actually don't know. I will just point you some of the proposed mechanism how the food allergy have a relationship with the exposure to the micro and nanoplastic, and how these exposure actually have maybe effects on the development of the severity, or enhance the rate, or raise the level of food allergic persons. For when we are talking about the food allergy, the inflammatory milieu with the predominant T2 type cells, it seems the most important, and especially because in that milieu, the development of the tolerance is less prevalent, and because of that, it's important to prevent predomination of Th2 cells, and if maybe, for instance, micro and nanoplastic have an impact on that deviation of the immune response, we can intervene in that process. How the micro and nanoplastic have an impact on that, for instance, on absorption of the food allergen, or for the activation of some epitopes, which are more allergenic potential, or enhance allergenicity of some food allergen, or have an impact of the barrier function, for instance, diversity and composition, or secretion of mucus in barriera, or damage some epithelial cells. Some cells we know, and some damage of these cells have an effects of the inflammatory response. It's important, not just endothelial cells and also dendritic cells. Michel already mentioned that. It's important cells, and also MCL cells in a pair plot patch, which are part of the inflammatory response, have an important effects on the development of the inflammation and deviation of the immune response, and the deviation of the intestinal barrier in the allergic persons. So when we summarize that, the potential effects of the MNPs on the gastrointestinal tract and on the development of food allergy is related with some physical hazard, chemical hazard, and biological hazards. And all of these effects actually have an results on the inflammation, or changes of the type of the inflammation, oxidative stress, and immune response. So the future research is something what we actually need to be sure how these changes have especially in humans, in clinical studies, have an effects which will be measurable for the development of, for instance, some food allergy. So our part in this Imptox consortia is related with the clinical study. Each clinical studies was conducted with my team from Zagreb, and we choose the vulnerable populations, the children population. Already mentioned that is an important population, especially that we know that any damaged or impact in that age actually have an influence on the their development of the disease and later in life. We included the children from 3 different regions in Croatia. I think that Tanya already mentioned that we collected the different biological samples, stool, induced sputum, exhaled condensate, and blood, and collected the questionnaire and from dietary habits, plastic usage, and some other important questions related to the exposure level or risk of the exposure to the micro and nanoplastics. We included more than 1,100 kids in our clinical studies, and I already mentioned that we collected different data from the different questionnaires. For instance, you can see here some of these questionnaires which we done in our clinical studies, Isaac Q questionnaire, exposure data, and so on. And also we will analyze some inflammatory markers in blood, in collected blood samples, and also some changes in gut microbiome in our patients. So the patients which are included in the clinical studies, we are categorized in the three groups according to the exposure or risk of the exposure level to micro and nanoplastics. And this is the cluster 1, and this is the first cluster in which are the subjects who are less exposed to micro and nanoplastics. You also can see here some relevant questions which we are included in this analysis and the clusterization of our subjects. And this is the second cluster. The most subjects in that cluster are as moderately exposed, about 80%, and small portion of these patients are slightly exposed, while there were in this cluster no highly exposed subjects. And finally, the third cluster is the kids which were high exposed or they are most exposed to micro and nanoplastics. Half of the subjects in these clusters are categorized as highly exposed according to these questions. I just mentioned some of these important questions. You also can see a number of the subjects per cluster. In the first cluster, we separate 160, in another more than 600, and in the first cluster more than 300 subjects. And you also can see here distribution, all variables which are included is categorization of the clusters, and we also perform some statistical analysis. We in logistic regression analysis, we include several significant factors associated with the exposure to inhaled and food allergen, and also we and also exposure to micro and nanoplastics in cluster 2 and 3. And when we analyze all tested inhaled and food allergen, we shown the statistically significant association between exposure to in these two clusters to micro and nanoplastics and development of the sensitization level to inhaled and also to food allergen. And you also can see here when we analyzed separately cluster sensitization and risk of sensitization to inhaled allergen. It seems that there are a stronger relationship between exposure to micro and nanoplastics or risk to exposure to micro and nanoplastic and sensitization to inhaled allergen and sensitization. Then in food allergen, this sensitization, it seems higher in a cluster 2 than in a cluster 3. In a food allergen, in a cluster 3, it was found the increased risk, but it's not, it seems now is not statistically significant, but this, it seems a good signal. Now we already analyzed some more results. The signal is much stronger. It thinks it also will be important from the statistical point of view and also regarding the sensitization to food allergen. There are a lot of works we should finish. We should analyze all collected samples, and I hope that for instance, in the next meeting, we will show more important results. In conclusion, now we know that micro nanoplastic have an influence on the human health. Epithelial barrier hypothesis seems and also allergic inflammation. It seems the most important pathomechanism for that development in our population. About 1/3 of our subjects are at high risk regarding exposure to MNPs, and according to preliminary results, there are relationship between exposure to micro and nanoplastic and the level of development of sensitization to inhaled and as well as the food allergen. Thank you very much for your attention.
So thank you very much. We are running a little bit behind in the time, so the questions will be a bit shorter, but I'd like to invite Ian up as a moderator for the questions, and I'd like to invite all of the speakers up. We will have a combination of Slido questions as well as questions from the audience, and I'd like to ask, yes, can I get Laura? Just a second.
I think we should.
Yeah.
May as well start.
With the audience.
I'm going to start with the audience. You've sat there quietly. Questions for the panel? Hands up, please, if you have one. Because if you don't, I'm going to launch into them. Yes, please.
Thank you. Thanks a lot for giving me the floor. My name is Panagiotis Kaslaridis. I'm Senior Policy Advisor of the European Federation of Allergy and Airways Diseases Patients Associations. IFA, for short, brings together 45 national organizations in 26 countries. We represent more than 200 million people in Europe with allergy, asthma, and chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. As you know, allergy and asthma are very much very common chronic diseases with much higher prevalence among children and young population. I must admit that from an IFA perspective, the links between microplastics and nanoplastics and the development of allergy and asthma have been running under our radars. It's not because it's a lack of interest, but rather because far too often patients and the organizations representing them are not considered adequately in the research agenda setting. So it's really encouraging to see that for diseases, for chronic diseases that do not have a cure, there is research going on and on the potential triggers and causes. The patients we represent are very much aware of the allergy that allergy and asthma are fundamentally complex diseases with complex trigger mechanisms. Scientists across the globe are working to explain the interlinks between genetics and the environment. And your research has the potential to bring together evidence on behavioral and regulatory components of the impacts of these particles in allergy and respiratory diseases, in order to take actions and decrease their burden for patients. So we are encouraged and relieved that this research line goes on and can have a great impact on patients. That's why I'm also intrigued to hear from Professor Velitkovits about her findings on pollen, for example, how those could guide further research and policy action to mitigate harmful exposure to health. But overall, again, encouraged and thankful about this work and would like to see it flourish and further collaborating with you, bringing the perspective of European patients and caregivers as research partners. Thanks a lot.
I think that was congratulations for you. If you could pass the microphone down.
Yes.
I think it wasn't really a question, but I think it does warrant a response. Yes.
Yeah. Thanks a lot for compliments. You actually had a question how to regulate respiratory allergies. Well, we need to regulate the pollen spread. At least talking about ambrosia, the most aggressive pollen in Southeast Europe, we need measures. Once we reduce the pollen counts, we will globally help patients. When it comes to the possible interactions with the micro-nanoplastics, especially in here, we still do not have no exposure data, but for sure we have to be cautious about this. We have two compounding factors: the environmental pollution coming from everywhere, from plastics, tires, and also pollens. And apparently, if you look at all the in vitro, in vivo results, and also the clinical study conducted, there could be an association. Thank you.
I have Slido questions.
Yes,
Some Slido questions have come in, and I'm trying to sort of like bring them together. But it's kind of interesting because you're at the end of a journey. I know you've got a bit of an extension, but you start and you have ambitions and you get to the end. Yeah. And along the way, in all of these projects, yeah, the thing which always happens is you discover something which you thought was utterly trivial is much more difficult than you ever imagined it was going to be. And the learnings you get from those are immense. And it's interesting, therefore, that most of the questions, I can summarize them thus. How do you sample microplastics and how do you measure them in a biologically sensible size range? Now, I'm sure some of you can volunteer to answer that question, or at least to illustrate to people that it's far from trivial. I'm looking at you, Leanne, to begin.
Well, sampling campaigns are going on in all of the CAS projects, and I think everybody has had a very nice spread of different types of environments that they're sampling in, and I think that's one of the big things that we're all contributing is we're showing different environments and different challenges in each environment. And the challenges of sampling in seawater are different than lake and river water, are different than our drinking water. And so what we're all coming together to find is that we need to look at the sampling methods, the handling methods, and then the analytical detection procedures very carefully, with each particular origin of the sample in mind. So we did a little bit of air sampling, and I have to admit we're just at the very beginning of understanding how robust our method is. We're working at the very limit of detection of some of the most advanced methods. So pyrolysis GCMS, TED GCMS, and so what my personal major challenge is understanding whether our results are robust when we're working at the detection limits of the available methodology. So I'm going to stop there.
That's a really interesting answer, but here's a secondary question. If it's that difficult to measure them in air and water, how difficult is it to measure it in a biological matrix, in blood, in a tissue, in a plant, even in a stool?
Okay, biological matrices are the most complex. And we indeed in Imptox project struggled for 2 years to develop an SOP for microplastics extraction protocol from foods, from shrimps and clams, in order to analyze the microplastics in the size of about 20 microns.
when it comes to the nanoplastics, we are not yet there. It's definitely not something you can do on a large number of samples to get certain statistics. We are still developing methods. When it comes to stool, it took us maybe 2 years to develop a protocol. This is quite challenging matrix because of a lot of cellulose, but we have developed a 100% chemical method, no enzymes needed. We have analyzed almost 60 children samples, which is, I believe, the record for children exposure to micronano. Again, we analyzed the nanoplastics. Is still very, very challenging because you really need to remove all the contaminating materials, meaning everything there. Any matrix residues remaining would actually influence your analytical method and diminish the signal. This is what we have seen with some other materials. When we analyzed our materials in pure water, the label materials, which you can expect higher sensitivity, we could observe nice signals, but in the presence of plant matrix, the signal was 10, 20, 50 times lower, meaning that the sensitivity got very low. We still need to improve the preparation, sample preparation. It takes literally weeks to prepare one sample for the analysis.
The reason I mentioned it is because the newspapers, the magazines, the media is always full of stories, isn't it, about discovering microplastics everywhere, in everything, at all times.
I don't want to talk about.
I know, but I think the public need to know that it's not quite so straightforward. I have a question here, and it's an interesting one. I think it pulls together some of the discussions you've had, because throughout your talks this morning, you've been talking about interactions with algal toxins, bacterial toxins, allergens. And I have somebody on Slido who's asked a question really about, well, what is it then? What is the toxic pathway you're really going after when you combine the microparticles with a biological material, be that a virus or bacteria or a toxin? What is the mechanism? What are the health endpoints downstream? Right at the end, I think.
It's a complex question, and so is the answer. Depending on what is the cargo on the nanoplastics, that will very much influence what is the endpoint that we should be looking at. Looking at the endpoints, we also want to start from a very first initial molecular event in the adverse outcome pathways to count actually to whatever the final outcome is at the level of the organ or the system. So it will never be only one single thing. There is not one single strategy here. It's very much dependent on what we are looking at. Very much depends also on whether we talk about nanoplastics as particles, or we go that low in their size that we talk about molecules. And given that your toxicological outcome, the assessment of that, and also the modeling of them will be very difficult. And I think only in the next coming years we will be able to decipher the role of each of those elements, starting from the polymer type, the size, the molecular structure, and everything coming on the top of that to see where and which pathway is being used to come to a final endpoint. You can imagine that if we have things that work with a similar mode of action or same mode of action, and most likely more the mechanism of action, we might actually be able better to understand than we have the things that work opposite or in different directions.
We have an interesting question on that. I'm going to mix this up a bit. I'm going to go from the far end all the way across. Everybody has to speak, but you've only got one sentence to address this one question which has come in, which is, according to the experts, and that's you, which policy considerations do you think are lacking in this area? And how do you think a citizen should act? And I will put my hand up after you've had 30 seconds, so you're going to have to be quick. Right from the one end to this end, please.
The question is to me, then I would say that the role of citizens can only be achieved engagement in the citizen science.
One. Next, you have to do as well.
I think one action could be to really try to reduce the use of plastics that we are all that. So
And to add on this, of course, we are consuming food and we saw that nanoplastics is spread in the food, so we have to pay attention to what we're consuming and also maybe to try the alternatives.
Improving recycling policies and making sure that we get less material as waste in the environment.
I think closely monitor the situation of methods, both in the food packaging but also in sea waters.
I definitely agree with what has already been said regarding the informing the public, recycling more, reducing less. I could also say from our own experience in our project, what we have seen in the children, that they are mostly exposed to polypropylene and polyethylene, and these figures, frequency of exposure also match the adults' exposure. Then this is a point to go for preventively reducing exposure of children. So we are not yet sure is it really harmful, but it's
That was
okay.
2 minutes. Next one.
It's not too late to address what's been done, the effects that are coming from all these microplastics, but the best way is to prevent what will be in the future. So I'll leave that out. As citizens, we should prevent it from happening in the future while scientists are trying to solve what has been done.
Yeah, I would say just prepare the future, what can happen, and of course recycle and try to be more aware where it can be.
I believe we need to inform actually the public more on the health effects. I mean, from our perspective, that we know now that particles with allergens, and these are the ones that we inhale, that they, or we eat them as food, they could augment actually the immune response. I think we need to inform the public in order that they will recycle more, because that is what we need to do.
I think we need to reduce plastic use, plastic production, plastic waste, and we need strong policy from the government to do that.
I think it's important to educate and prevent exposure and enhance awareness how the potential hazard effects have micro and plastic in our health.
Here's an interest, but this is good news for you, because somebody's now asked, when are you doing this again? So there clearly is a hunger, I think, for that sort of information. So that's good. There's a question in the floor.
That's something Professor Stulpin didn't show in the slides because there was just not enough time. What we did a survey in our children's population, so over 1,100 children and their caregivers filled out a survey on the consumer awareness and perception of micro and nanoplastics, and we found very interesting results. So most of our population is aware of micro and nanoplastics, but what's worrisome is that they're very, very scared of it. I think delivering the right information in education and raising awareness and designing policies is crucial, because people know of micro nanoplastics, but they're really scared of it and they don't know what we know here. So I think delivering the right and well-placed information is crucial in these things.
Okay, I'm going to pick up enough. This slide, I think, is great. We should do this more often. I'm picking up a question here, and to me, it screams the risk of regrettable substitutions, and it takes me back, Leanne, to your talk where you were talking about design and having design principles. When are we going to have design principles for new materials which are released to the population and the environment, when their full life cycle of use and their potential impact on health and the ecosystem is considered, and not just economic value? And I'm asking you that because somebody specifically said, are bioplastics a solution? Discuss.
So many people have been trying to design safer bioplastics, but bioplastics are a term that can be misleading because they can be bio coming from a plant-based source and not as a petroleum product, but then they can also be biodegradable, which means that over a certain period of time in the environment, they might break down into their small molecule components. So they might break down into water and air. But the problem is perhaps sometimes the timing of this breakdown process. If it takes too long, they can still behave as plastics in the environment. And so we still have the same problem. Perhaps just to quickly address the first part of the question, yes, people are now designing materials with a certain life cycle in advance, but they don't have a lot of commercial incentive necessarily always, or regulatory incentive to think about what happens to these products once the consumer gets their hands on them. So we've got the ideal, but I don't think have the follow through in that respect. And a combination of consumer awareness, litigation, and policymaking may all come together to help us design materials that have a better life cycle.
You use the litigation word. And that's interesting, isn't it? Because you mentioned that and I immediately think, regulation. Some people like it. Some people loathe it. Some people think the solution to all of this is nudging the population through behavioral change and education. Some people think that's never really worked without, should we say, the stick and the carrot. Collectively, you can all answer this question. What do you think? Where does the line lie? If we have an ecological disaster, a potential health impact, how seriously should be this taken, and what should we be calling for?
Well, okay, that's good. Gives me time to think about it. So I'm very much in favor of education, but I think sometimes it's a bit of a too slow process compared to the emergency we have with these kind of problems. And so I think, or at least I expect from our politicians and from our lawmakers to really step in and intervene, because I think that's the only way that changes can be made faster and really have partially solved the problem or at least improve the situation.
Yeah, I think indeed the policymakers will be the final ones who are actually going to try to mitigate the risks, but they need risk assessment data to start doing that. And they need proposed alternatives. And those alternatives, they also need to go the scrutiny of risk assessment. And finally, I think we are not there yet to tell them what is a final solution. That's what I think.
So if I understood well, the question goes about the catastrophe and the challenges that we are facing. But we are here talking about from the eyes and mouth of the scientists, people who are supposed to know a lot, much more than the citizens, common citizens that are walking on the streets. So what we should not forget is that people are fighting not just exposure to microplastics. They are also fighting exposure to deprivations and so forth. So that means it's not only the science as we know it, and analysis and the collection of the data, but it's also the humans as they are, and also with their whole holistic approach. So that is also something to take into account. And when we analyze all of those, then the catastrophe takes another dimension, I think. Maybe it's much closer than this.
So you can ask the same question, exactly the same question about pandemics and about global warming or climate change. How have we done? What have we done and how well have we done it?
Well, I'd say that's a very good point. We know what happens when people think there's an emergency. We had a pandemic. We have climate change. Is the behavior and the action proportionate? No, clearly not. But that's just my opinion. I'm not allowed to have one. Look, we have 6 minutes left, only 6 minutes left. and I'm going to attempt to configure your next grant application going forward. I know this is meant to take months, but it's not going to take months because you are now each going to say what you're going to do next, what you think the big question is. And I'm afraid you're only going to have about 30 seconds each. You're going to start at this end, this time we go to that end, then you're going to say, what do we do next? What are the next big questions?
Okay, I'm not ready.
You're not meant to be, just let it come.
Okay. So I think we should include more subjects and collect more results and to be more conclusive regarding the exposure and the development of the allergic diseases. It's something what we should done in the next round.
So this is scale.
We're going to do more complex mixtures and more chronic exposure in a variety of animal models.
We need to include actually more patients to really be sure what happens. I would also like to have particles, for instance, the combination. I've heard so much. So particles, for instance, what you told us, and then with corona, with allergens. I think now we have just used allergens in corona formation, but there is so much more we know now outside. So these particles needs to be loaded with much, much more in order actually to see what happens in the immune system.
Well, I will just say, yes, we have to work on holistic approach or holistic impact because we are not exposed only to one single particle or to one single allergen. And it has to be over time exposure. So that's something that we have to address, of course. That's something that's important to obtain more data for the future risk assessments, which will make policy briefs.
What we do in the lab is we isolate each condition alone and we try to address each condition separately. But in reality, what we have in the environment is an accumulation or agglomeration of everything, which makes things way more complicated. So we have to find a way or develop methods to address these or to at least understand how to address these issues in the future, which is a pressing thing now. So
the next work will be follow-up of the improvement of the analytical methods in biological sample preparation. We are still at the infancy when it comes to the nanoplastics. I believe that this is where we can make a contribution. And of course, we will probably follow up this line of selective allergens binding to the plastics. We can now go for more comprehensive characterization, registration of new allergens, and probably look for similar allergens in other pollens.
Well, we know that microplastics serve as vectors for binding different metals, toxic ones as well. And the question is now whether the humans are equipped to actually fight the toxicity of those hybrid materials. So we know that humans have means to deal with toxic metals because we have defense systems, but we don't know how that works if they absorb some plastics. Whether we have actually tools to, to actually immune defense against such vectors and metals in them.
I want to set up a network of material producers. I've identified about 186 different varieties of materials that we could produce to satisfy all of your needs. And I thought if we work together in a harmonized manner, we could maybe actually bring these materials to you more quickly.
So looking into the exposure assessment, it was quite easy to think about because we have to be sure what kind of characteristics are important and which one we have to evaluate exposure assessment. Is it only microplastic particles? Is it microplastics together with whatever they are carrying on? Is it together with pathogens or not? So this is what we are going to do. And at the end of the next project, we will know much more about this characterization and impact on exposure assessment.
A risky question, actually. But what we develop now in the preparation of the new call is already very comprehensive and complex RP framework, coupled to very complex models with related endpoints and several different contexts and scenarios in which we are going to test them.
So regarding the carriage of bacteria and pathogenic bacteria by microplastics, I think for me the next step should be trying to add the host of this bacteria as a partner in the interaction, and to look at whether bacteria that are on plastics are infecting more easily the host, and then are they more pathogenic, or the effect of the bacteria different when they are carried by microplastics or if they arrive alone. So that's really going to the next step in the infectious process.
I believe this session was meant to go to 1300, yes? On that basis, you are 3. Thank you for your time.